Imagine lying down for the night, not thinking about unread emails, looming deadlines, or the mental avalanche that comes from doom scrolling past 1 a.m. In ancient Rome, bedtime wasn't a battle, it was a birthright. Sleep wasn't delayed by binge-watching mediocre historical dramas. It was the historical drama, with a cast of characters snoring under a shared roof, and a soundtrack provided by cicadas, the distant hum of fountains, and occasionally, a very angry donkey. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this. And hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The ancient Roman mindset towards sleep was blissfully simple. If it's dark, go to bed. If it's light, consider being conscious. There were no productivity hacks, no coffee-fueled grindset bros, yelling at you to rise at 4 a.m. and conquer your empire before breakfast. In fact, if you did wake up before dawn, it usually meant one of three things: your roof had collapsed, your slave was waking you for a truly inconvenient Senate meeting, or you were being robbed. Again, to Romans, sleep wasn't some passive afterthought squashed between Zoom meetings and existential dread. It was a rhythm of life. It happened when it was supposed to, because everything from work to meals to religion was attuned to the natural light of the day. And since sundials aren't exactly built for late-night productivity, most folks naturally unwound with the sunset. No need for melatonin gummies. The ancient cure for insomnia was living a life so physically exhausting that even the local stray cats couldn't keep their eyes open by nightfall. But there's more to it than just being tired. Romans considered sleep part of their moral and physical well-being. Philosophers like Seneca and Pliny the Elder weren't just out here pondering metaphysics. They wrote about sleep like modern influencers, talk about hydration and manifesting good vibes. Seneca even advised his readers to go to sleep with a clear conscience, which is adorable coming from a guy who worked for Nero. But the message was clear. Sleep wasn't just a bodily function, it was an ethical act. You were supposed to earn it by living a balanced life, free of excess, regret, or heaven forbid, improper digestion. That's right, digestion was big in Rome. Everyone from the lowest peasant to the highest patrician knew that stuffing yourself silly before bed meant dreams full of chaos, demons, or indigestion-fueled hallucinations. The ideal Roman evening meal, the cena, was lengthy, but not gluttonous. Eat, talk, drink a little. Okay, sometimes a lot, and then settle in. No late-night pizza orders, no energy drinks, no lying awake because you just had to eat 3 roasted dormice and a honey-glazed fig brick. And since Romans weren't bathing in artificial light like we are today, their bodies were perfectly aligned with circadian rhythms. Candlelight was about as wild as it got after dark, unless you were an emperor throwing a suspiciously well-lit private gathering involving torches, fire dancers, and moral decay. But for the average citizen, the only blue light they saw at night was the moon. And it didn't ping them with messages from their supervisor about that papyrus they still hadn't filed. Their homes, too, supported this mindset. Most Roman domus had small windowless bedrooms, cubicula, that kept out the light, noise, and prying eyes. The focus was rest, not decoration. There were no motivational posters, no weird throw pillows embroidered with live laugh love in Latin. The space existed to help you stop existing for a few hours. You didn't lie in bed worrying about your to-do list. You lay there thinking, if Mars doesn't smite me in my sleep, it's a good night. Even public life respected sleep. The legal day in Rome didn't begin until dawn. Most shops opened late in the morning. Courts wouldn't even start until everyone had enough time to wake up, eat bread, yell at their neighbor's rooster, and show up in a tunic that hopefully wasn't inside out. Modern society expects you to be fully productive by 8 a.m. Ancient Romans expected you to still be blinking at the sun, wondering what day it was. Sure, the Romans had their share of stress, barbarian invasions, lead in the water, the occasional firestorm erupting in the Colosseum, but they didn't manufacture stress the way we do. They didn't invent inboxes or push notifications or Slack channels that never sleep. They didn't ask, did I do enough today? They asked, did I not offend Jupiter? Did I pay my taxes? And did I remember to oil the door hinges so they don't squeak during my nap? Sleep wasn't something to optimize, it was something to respect. Not because it made them better workers, but because it made them better humans. To sleep well was to live well. And maybe, just maybe, to dream of something other than the endless parade of deadlines, emails, and late-night shame scrolling that haunts the modern soul. Because in ancient Rome, the only thing glowing at night was the moon, and possibly a fire. And if it was a fire, well, good morning. If you were a wealthy Roman, sleep wasn't just something you did, it was something you curated. We're talking about the difference between falling asleep and reclining upon artisanal furniture, while slaves adjust your drapery and incense. Smoke gently wafts through a hand-carved marble doorway. Welcome to the world of the cubiculum, the Roman elite's version of the master suite, minus the flat-screen TV and suspiciously decorative pillows that serve no purpose. Let's begin with the basics. The Roman bedroom wasn't some oversized cavern with 50 throw blankets and an emotional support diffuser. The cubiculum, plural cubicula, was usually small, windowless, and deliberately dark. Not in a depressing renter in a basement apartment way, but in a this room was designed to block out every living sound from the street, including the guy yelling about olives at 3 a.m. kind of way. These rooms were meant to be quiet, private sanctuaries where the chaos of Roman urban life couldn't reach you, even if the neighbors were sacrificing a goat next door. Again, despite their size, these rooms were elegant. Roman walls were rarely left bare. Even in a small bedroom, you might find vivid frescoes of landscapes, gods, or mythological soap operas, usually featuring at least one toga malfunction, and someone getting turned into a swan. These paintings weren't just for decoration, they set a mood. Imagine trying to fall asleep while Hercules clubbed a centaur 2 feet from your head. Now that's interior design with dramatic flair. The centerpiece of any cubiculum, of course, was the lectus, the Roman bed. And let's be clear, this wasn't some IKEA flat pack you built once and cursed forever. The lectus was a statement, a symbol, a multifunctional piece of furniture that served as bed, couch, social platform, and occasional deathbed, depending on the day's events. It usually had a wooden frame, high enough off the ground to stash valuables or small livestock, if you were feeling frugal. The mattress, stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool, depending on your social standing, and how often you complained about your back. And yes, while Romans didn't invent memory foam, the rich absolutely had people to remember the firmness for them. Pillows were filled with feathers, wool, or down, and there were slaves whose literal job it was to fluff them. That's right, where you might casually punch your pillow into shape before bedtime, a Roman senator would ring a bell, and someone would sprint in, armed with goose feathers and duty. And don't forget the linens. Roman elites adored textiles, Egyptian cotton, imported, dyed fabrics, absolutely. Linen sheets? Only if they were ironed smoother than a politician's excuse. Some households even had embroidered bedding, because nothing says power nap like dozing off beneath a stitched depiction of your family tree, complete with questionable ancestors and a triumph or two. But the real luxury was privacy. Unlike the average Roman who might share a floor mat with 5 cousins and a chicken, the rich had bedrooms set apart from the main public areas of the house, located deep within the domus, often around the peristyle courtyard. These rooms could be completely closed off. Thick walls and wooden doors with actual locks ensured that, at bedtime, you were undisturbed by your in-laws, your guests, or that one senator who always popped by, unannounced, to complain about aqueduct maintenance. The air, perfumed. Romans didn't just burn incense. They infused their entire home with fragrances. Lavender, myrrh, rose oil. If it came in a jar and smelled vaguely expensive, it probably ended up in the bedroom. And yes, ventilation mattered. Openings near the ceiling could allow hot air to rise. And in summer, some elite homes even included cooling systems using water channels under the floor. It wasn't exactly central air, but it beat, sweating through your wool tunic. Lighting, meanwhile, was all about ambiance. Rich Romans didn't light their bedrooms like a crime scene. They used oil lamps. Some basic, some ornate, some shaped like mythological creatures that probably gave you weird dreams if you stared at them too long. The soft flicker of the flame made everything look calm, warm, and vaguely seductive. Not that you'd admit that publicly, of course. Romans were dignified. Now, if you were really rolling in denarii, you didn't stop at one bedroom. Some wealthy Romans had multiple cubicula for different times of day or seasons. A winter bedroom, smaller and closer to the hearth. A summer one, breezier, often near the garden, or impluvium, a water feature that doubled as a mosquito party pit. The height of luxury wasn't just comfort, it was options. Even guests got the royal treatment. If you were a visiting dignitary or cousin from out of town, you'd be offered a well-appointed guest cubiculum, complete with fresh linens, a light snack, and probably a minor servant assigned to guard your shoes. Hospitality was serious business. After all, a man who slept well was less likely to stab you in the Senate the next morning. So no, Romans didn't have orthopedic mattresses. They had something better. Absolute control over their sleep environment, built on wealth, architecture, and the labor of many, many people who weren't allowed to sleep nearly as well. Their bedrooms weren't just rooms, they were curated experiences, early prototypes of the modern luxury hotel, just with more mosaics and slightly more casual slavery. If you were poor in ancient Rome, and let's face it, statistically, you didn't sleep in a bedroom. You slept in a space that could generously be described as wherever no one was yelling, bleeding, or actively using it. For the urban poor, sleep wasn't something you planned. It was something you snatched, like a crust of bread or an ounce of dignity. Let's start with slaves, who made up a massive chunk of Rome's population. They did everything: cooked, cleaned, raised their master's children, taught their master's children, and in many cases were their master's children. Long story, don't ask. Sleep for a slave wasn't so much a daily ritual as it was a bodily rebellion. You didn't schedule it. Your body simply shut down when it couldn't be flogged awake anymore. Slaves slept wherever there was space, and space here means not currently being trampled. Some had assigned spots near their master's quarters to be on hand at all hours. Of course, others curled up in hallways, kitchens, or stables. You think your apartment is small? Try sharing a windowless pantry with 3 other humans and a goose that bites when you move. You didn't need blackout curtains when your bedroom was a broom closet with ambition. And don't even think about bedding. If you were lucky, you got a pile of straw. If you were really lucky, it didn't have a rat in it. Most slaves just slept on the floor, stone in the summer, cold stone in the winter, and slightly damp stone during literally any month with humidity. No pillow, no blanket, just exhaustion, and maybe the vague warmth of another body pressed uncomfortably close to yours, because central heating was a thing reserved for emperors and hallucinations. Let's talk about urban laborers, the free poor who weren't enslaved but still woke up every day wondering how to afford their next bowl of lentils. Many lived in insulae, the Roman version of apartment buildings, though calling them buildings is giving them more credit than they deserve. Think 5-story fire traps built with questionable wood, no plumbing, and stairs that looked like they were designed by someone who actively hated knees. The higher you lived in an insula, the cheaper the rent, and the more likely it was that your floor would collapse in the middle of the night. That's not a joke. Collapsing insulae were such a common problem that Roman satirists wrote poems about them. But if you managed to survive gravity's wrath, you'd probably sleep in a one-room unit, shared with your entire family, your in-laws, and a suspicious number of clay pots. What did you sleep on? Often, just a mat, sometimes a wooden plank. If you were feeling fancy, maybe a pile of rags. The room would double as kitchen, dining hall, workspace, and nursery. So yes, you could technically say the Roman poor were pioneers of open-plan living, just without the luxury, privacy, or Pinterest board. Privacy, by the way, was a fantasy. If someone got up to use the chamber pot, everyone knew. If someone missed the chamber pot, everyone smelled. Babies cried, people snored, and someone was always coughing ominously in the corner, like an unpaid extra in a tragic opera. Yet somehow, they still managed to fall asleep, because they were bone-tired and had to be up at dawn to haul bricks, push carts, or fish questionable meat out of the Tiber. Let's not forget the rural poor, farmers, herders, and shepherds. These folks technically had more space, but they also had more nature, which meant more bugs, wolves, and weather that didn't care about your circadian rhythm. Rural laborers often slept in huts made of mud, sticks, and optimism. They might sleep in the same room as their livestock, not for fun, but for warmth and security. Ever tried to fall asleep next to a snoring cow? It's like sharing a bed with a foghorn wrapped in leather. And for those who were completely homeless or enslaved in public works, sleep meant curling up on the street, under porticos, in markets after they closed, or wherever there was enough shadow to avoid getting stepped on. The good news? You got 6 hours of sleep. The bad news? 3 of them were standing up, with one eye open and your coin pouch clutched like a newborn. Sleep for the Roman working class was not restorative, it was functional. You slept because you had no choice, not because it was time, not because it was peaceful, but because your body stopped negotiating with you. There were no sleep routines, no scented oils, no turn-down service. If someone turned down anything, it was probably your request for more straw. And yet, perhaps paradoxically, these people probably slept deeply. Their days were full of hard labor, long walks, and exposure to actual sunlight. They weren't overstimulated by screens or caffeine or late-night existential crises brought on by binging 3 seasons of bad television. They were, quite literally, too tired to worry. So the next time you toss and turn on your overpriced mattress, wondering why you can't fall asleep despite your smart light bulbs and curated whale song playlist, just remember, the Roman poor had no Spotify, no ergonomic pillow, and definitely no peace. But they still passed out cold on a dirt floor with a goat as a foot warmer. Now that's resilience. Picture this. It's midnight in ancient Rome. The streets are silent, the lamps are flickering low, and the city is tucked into slumber. But inside your modest Roman home, you suddenly wake up. Not because of stress, not because of a bladder emergency, and definitely not because your phone buzzed with a 50% off olive oil notification. You're awake because you're supposed to be. Welcome to Bifasic Sleep, the wildly underrated ancient practice of sleeping in 2 shifts. This wasn't a fluke or a symptom of insomnia, it was completely normal. Romans, and many pre-industrial societies for that matter, often slept in 2 chunks, with a brief window of wakefulness in between. And no, this wasn't a chaotic free-for-all, it was a system, a routine, a lifestyle choice, so oddly structured, it makes modern sleep schedules look like a toddler's scribble. The cycle worked like this. People would go to bed shortly after sunset and sleep for a few hours. That was the first sleep. Then, somewhere around midnight, they'd naturally wake up. Not bolt upright in a panic, mind you, just ease into a calm, groggy half-consciousness, like a cat who remembered it, left something in the other room. This intermission lasted anywhere from 1 to 2 hours. Then came the second sleep, which carried them through to sunrise. Now, you might ask, what did they do in the middle of the night? And the answer is, just about everything except doom scrolling. Some used the break to pray or reflect, philosophers like Pliny the Younger and Galen, ancient Rome's favorite multitasker, who somehow dabbled in medicine, philosophy, and writing like he was trying to beat a high score, mentioned these nighttime hours as a perfect time for deep thinking. No distractions, no sunlight, no toga inspections, just you, your candle, and your existential dread. Others took a more sensual approach. Roman texts and poetry make more than a few passing comments about midnight being the perfect window for intimacy. Let's be honest. The kids were asleep, the goats were finally quiet, and no one was knocking on your door, demanding a tax payment. If there was ever a moment to do something romantic, it was right after your first nap, and before the sun started ruining everything. Some even used this interlude to get actual work done. Letters could be written, documents copied, clothes mended. Some scholars believe that this window of quiet wakefulness was prized by scribes, priests, and insomniac emperors alike for its calm clarity. Try telling your boss today that you'll submit your quarterly report at 1:45 a.m., because that's when the muses strike. But let's not romanticize it too much. The average Roman probably used this time for slightly less poetic reasons. Stoking the fire, checking that the roof wasn't leaking, or grumbling about how cold it was. Still, it wasn't considered bad to be awake at midnight. It wasn't a sleep disorder. It was intermission. The halftime show of your unconsciousness. And unlike modern 3 a.m. awakenings, usually followed by spiraling thoughts about taxes, mortality, and whether you accidentally liked your ex's old vacation photo, this one was peaceful, expected, and dare we say cozy. The biphasic pattern worked hand in hand with natural circadian rhythms, especially in a world without artificial lighting. Once the sun went down, your body naturally began to wind down. A few hours of rest, and your melatonin factory was still chugging along. That short nighttime pause didn't mess you up. It actually helped regulate your sleep in digestible chunks. Instead of fighting sleep like we do today with stimulants, bright screens, and a small army of caffeinated regrets, Romans leaned into sleep's natural rhythm like a symphony. And when the second sleep began, it wasn't some groggy crawl back to the same awkward position. It was a full-on return to dreamland. People often reported that the second sleep was deeper, more vivid, and more restful. Historians believe this was the part of the night when the more bizarre, mystical dreams happened, the kind Romans might interpret as divine messages or signs from beyond. If you were hoping to get a visit from the god Mercury about your career path, you'd better hold out for second sleep. First sleep was just the warm-up act. Interestingly, the biphasic sleep pattern stuck around in various forms for centuries. Even during the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, people referenced first sleep and second sleep like it was common knowledge. It only began to vanish with the rise of industrialization, artificial lighting, and the capitalist brainchild of the standardized 9-to-5 workday. That's right. Factories, street lamps, and train schedules collectively murdered our ancestral nap plan and replaced it with "you must be asleep" from 11 o'clock to 7 o'clock, or you're broken. In ancient Rome, though, waking up at 2 a.m. wasn't a crisis. It wasn't cause for self-diagnosis or melatonin tablets. It was just the middle part. You'd go stoke the fire, whisper a prayer to your household gods, maybe roll over and whisper something slightly less sacred to your partner, and then drift right back into part 2 of your regularly scheduled brain reboot. Romans pioneered the midnight snack, minus the fridge, the lights, or the snacks. They accepted that the human body isn't a machine to be turned off and on with precision. Sometimes it needs a break from the break, and honestly, when you compare that with modern sleep hygiene apps yelling at you to dim your lights and journal your feelings while chamomile steam seeps into your pores, it almost makes you miss the simplicity of waking up in the dark, stretching beside a clay oil lamp, and knowing that this was just halftime. If you've ever had a bizarre dream and thought, "What does this mean?" Congratulations. You and an ancient Roman have something in common, only difference. You wake up and Google it. They woke up and consulted a priest, a scroll, or a temple full of snakes. For the Romans, dreams weren't just nighttime brain spaghetti. They were celestial memos, delivered via sleep, from gods with surprisingly cryptic handwriting. In ancient Rome, dreams were serious business. They weren't brushed off as the mind's recycling bin. Oh no, dreams were thought to be messages from the divine, whispers from Jupiter, visions from Mercury, or occasionally, a cryptic emoji from Apollo. If your dream involved flying, snakes, or your neighbor turning into a swan, again, it wasn't nonsense, it was divine insight. Probably, maybe, depending on the priest. The Romans actually categorized dreams. There were 5 types according to dream expert Artemidorus. A Greek, yes, but wildly influential in Roman culture. These included oneiro, direct messages from the gods, horomata visions, crematismoi, oracular dreams, enipnia, daily thought leftovers, and phantasiae, hallucinations probably caused by spoiled fish. You see, not all dreams were created equal. If you dreamed of your deceased uncle yelling at you about overdue taxes, that might be written off as indigestion. But if you dreamed of Jupiter appearing on a golden throne and smiting your neighbor's fig tree, you better believe a priest was getting involved. Immediately. And speaking of priests, let's talk about the VIP dream destination of the Roman world, the sleep temples. Yes, you heard that right. Rome and its broader Greco-Roman cultural sphere offered temple sleep as an actual service. Called incubatio, this ritual involved spending the night in a sacred temple, often dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing, in hopes of receiving a prophetic dream. You'd fast, purify yourself, maybe sacrifice a chicken, and then lie down in a designated dream chamber. Ideally, without the chicken. Once asleep, you'd wait, not just for rest, but for divine instruction. The idea was that the god would appear to you in your dreams and offer insight, healing advice, or occasionally, a cryptic riddle that made less sense than your cousin's wine-fueled conspiracy theories. Temples like those in Epidaurus and Pergamon were world-renowned for this practice, and the Romans adopted it with their usual flair. They didn't invent the idea, but they perfected the red-tiled, incense-smothered, divine snooze aesthetic. Sleep in these temples was communal, ritualized, and very regulated. There were rules, sacred guardians, and sometimes sacred animals walking around. Yes, snakes, actual sacred snakes. You haven't had a spiritual awakening until one curls up next to your foot while you're trying to summon Apollo. And the best part? The priests wrote down your dreams. That's right. Ancient dream journaling was real, except instead of you doing it, someone else transcribed your sleep vision and then interpreted it using a combo of theology, mythology, and gut instinct. Dreamed of rain? That could mean fertility or chaos. Dreamed of fire, maybe divine wrath or a new beginning. Dreamed of your ex? Jupiter's probably sending mixed signals again. Classic. For elite Romans, senators, generals, emperors, these dreams could influence major decisions. Whole wars were launched after a vivid dream. People built temples, changed laws, or postponed battles based on what they saw in their sleep, and no one thought this was strange. In fact, ignoring a prophetic dream was dangerous. Business. That's how you end up cursed, humiliated, or worse, lampooned in some poet's passive-aggressive satire. Take Emperor Augustus, for example. According to legend, his mother dreamed that her womb was set alight by lightning, an image later interpreted as divine foreshadowing of his future glory. Whether or not Augustus actually rose to power because of his mother's fiery uterus is still debated by scholars, but what matters is people believed it, and in Rome, belief had teeth. Of course, not everyone had access to fancy temples or priests with time for your "I turned into a turtle" dream. For the everyday Roman, dream interpretation was more DIY. There were dream books, manuals that offered pre-written interpretations of common images. Dreaming of flying, good omen. Dreaming of death, usually meant long life. Dreaming of teeth falling out. That one's been terrifying humanity for over 2,000 years, and still has no satisfying answer. And let's be honest, some Romans probably just made it up. If your dream conveniently aligned with your political ambition, or justified marrying a woman who was technically your cousin, hey, it must be fate. The gods had spoken. Who were the rest of us to argue? But perhaps the most fascinating part is this. They never saw dreams as just sleep trash. For Romans, sleep was a doorway, not just to rest, but to the divine. You didn't need therapy. You needed a nap and a priest with a strong opinion. They treated dreams like texts from the universe, sometimes helpful, sometimes cryptic, sometimes just terrifyingly weird, but always meaningful. So next time you wake up wondering why you dreamed of riding a giraffe through your high school, with Julius Caesar wearing a tutu, just know the Romans would have taken you seriously, very seriously. They might have even built a shrine to that giraffe. You've just had a long Roman morning, perhaps overseeing your estate, supervising your slaves as they try not to mess up your marble courtyard, or dramatically pacing the forum in your finest toga, pretending to understand politics. Now it's noon, the sun is at full burn, and your brain has the consistency of day-old porridge. What do? You nap, obviously. In ancient Rome, midday rest wasn't laziness. It was cultural wisdom. They didn't call it burnout, because no Roman was foolish enough to push through the hottest part of the day just to impress someone at the olive oil co-op. Instead, they had meridiatio, the glorious Roman custom of stopping life cold around midday for a little food, a little drink, and a little doze. And let's be clear, if it was good enough for emperors, it was good enough for you. Unlike today's over-caffeinated, always-on society that treats rest as a sign of moral failure, the Romans leaned into leisure like it owed them money. The entire rhythm of the day, especially in southern Italy, where the sun could roast your eyebrows off by 1 p.m, was designed around pausing. You got up early, got your business done in the morning, and by the time the sun started threatening to melt your sandals, it was time to find a shady spot and flop down like a decorative villa statue. The Roman day was divided into 12 watches, from sunrise to sunset, and sometime around the 6th hour, roughly our noon, things just stopped. Markets closed, public offices emptied, even legal proceedings hit pause. If you tried to sue someone at 12:30, the judge would likely be halfway through a wine-soaked fig tart and extremely unavailable. And what did people do during this downtime? They ate a lot. The midday meal prandium might include bread, cheese, olives, leftovers from the cena the night before, and enough wine to make you forget you had responsibilities. But food was just the opening act. After lunch came the real star, the nap. This wasn't some stolen 5-minute doze behind a scroll rack. No, the Romans approached napping like a sacred ritual. You'd change into lighter clothing, possibly just a tunic, or even less if you were at home and feeling sassy. Lie down somewhere cool and shaded, and surrender yourself to sweet, wine-induced oblivion. Think of it as the original soft life movement, except with more terracotta and fewer scented candles. Elite Romans had the luxury of location. They might nap in specially designed OC lounging rooms, peristyles, courtyards with shady columns, or even dedicated sleeping alcoves. Many villas had open-air spots for lounging that caught the breeze just right. No need for box fans or background noise generators. Just the sound of rustling leaves and distant murmurs of slaves arguing over a dropped amphora. But even the working classes tried to squeeze in a little midday rest. Farmers, craftsmen, and labourers often took a break in the shade, leaned against a wall, or napped under a cart if it was parked just right. Was it comfortable? Not even remotely, but the sun dictated the schedule, not the foreman. If you worked through noon, you weren't ambitious. You were heat-stroked, and one bad decision away from being a historical footnote. And while napping was practical, it was also philosophically endorsed. Stoic and Epicurean writers didn't just praise moderation in eating and emotion. They often included rest as part of the ideal life. True wisdom, they said, was knowing when to act and when to lie perfectly still while digesting lentils. Carpe diem is often misquoted as seize the day, but for many Romans, it really meant seize the nap before the kids start screaming again. Even military leaders respected the power of a nap. The Roman army, known for its brutal efficiency, often drilled early and rested during the hottest parts of the day. If a centurion caught you sleeping on duty at night, you'd be flogged, or worse. But catch you passed out at noon under a fig tree, completely acceptable, expected, even. Only lunatics fought in full armor at high noon. Hannibal may have crossed the Alps, but even he probably took a nap afterward. And of course, there's the emperor class. Men like Hadrian and Augustus were known to rest midday, not because they were lazy, but because ruling an empire while deliriously tired tends to end poorly. See Caligula. The midday nap was part of the imperial schedule. Eat, nap, wake up refreshed and ready to issue decrees or declare yourself a god, whichever came first. Modern productivity gurus might clutch their tablets at the idea, but the Romans got it right. Rest wasn't weakness. It was balance. They didn't fear downtime. They built their lives around it. Their cities, laws, and social rituals respected the human need to not function at full speed when the sun was trying to kill everyone. So next time you feel guilty for dozing off after lunch, just remember, Romans invented the power nap, minus the power, plus a toga and some grapes. If you worked after noon, you were either poor or possessed, or both. And frankly, if Caesar himself could conquer Gaul and catch 40 winks in the same afternoon, maybe you deserve to close your laptop and do the same. Let's face it, sleeping in the modern world is like trying to meditate during a monster truck rally. If it's not your upstairs neighbor rehearsing their interpretive clog dancing routine at midnight, it's some guy with a motorcycle that sounds like a dragon coughing up a toaster. But in ancient Rome, they had a secret weapon against noise, heat, and nocturnal flute solos: architecture. Now, Roman architecture was many things: grand, over the top, occasionally held together with hope and optimism. But when it came to sleep, it was strategic. Romans, especially the wealthy, knew how to build homes that doubled as fortresses of rest. Villas weren't just status symbols, they were noise-cancelling, temperature-regulating sleep machines, disguised as luxury real estate. Let's start with the walls. Roman walls weren't the paper-thin whispers we live with today. No drywall here. They used concrete, yes, real concrete. 2 millennia before modern contractors figured out how to overcharge for it, the Romans called it opus caementia, and it was a glorious, durable blend of lime, volcanic ash, rubble, and engineering confidence. This stuff was dense. We're talking walls up to 2 feet thick, often finished with stone, brick, or fancy stucco for dramatic flair. In other words, their walls were thicker than your cousin's skull, which was ideal, not just for withstanding earthquakes, invasions, and sudden wine-fueled arguments, but for sleeping through chaos. These walls absorbed sound like a sponge absorbs wine at a Roman banquet. Inside a proper villa, You weren't likely to hear your neighbor's midnight argument about who overwatered the fig tree, or the local bard's 15th attempt at ode to that girl he met at the bathhouse. And soundproofing wasn't the only benefit. Those chunky walls were thermal regulators too. Romans knew a thing or two about passive cooling. By using materials like stone, concrete, and terracotta, they created interiors that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter, without needing central air or a dozen fans pointed directly at your face. Even the layout of the Roman house was part of the plan. In the classic Roman domus, urban home of the wealthy, sleep-worthy rooms weren't plopped by the front door or near the street like a modern apartment. They were tucked away deep inside the structure, around a central courtyard known as the peristyle. These internal rooms, especially the cubiculum or sleeping chambers, were shielded from the street noise by layer after layer of walls, corridors, and awkward family portraits in mosaic form. And there's more. Roman architects understood the importance of natural insulation. Villas and country homes were often built with tufa, a porous volcanic stone that was not only plentiful, but had natural insulating properties. It kept heat out, trapped cool air in, and generally made life bearable when the Mediterranean sun tried to turn your furniture into a skillet. Then there's the roof design. Roman homes used sloped terracotta tiles, not only to look good, but to channel water, prevent leaks, and muffle the sound of rain. Imagine lying in bed as a gentle drizzle patters above you, muffled by layered ceramic. No tin can rack it, no dripping ceiling tiles, just nature's lullaby brought to you by a guy in a tunic who knew how to stack clay. In villas, things got even fancier. Wealthy landowners built countryside estates with strategically oriented bedrooms. Sleeping quarters were often placed to catch the prevailing breeze in summer and avoid it entirely in winter. Some had porticos that acted as natural windbreaks. Others planted trees or built fountains in the courtyard to cool the air and drown out distant peasant drama. The rich weren't just sleeping well, they were sleeping engineered, and lest we forget the floor. Romans knew how to build quiet from the ground up. They used layered flooring systems, sometimes incorporating air spaces or hypocaust systems. That's right, underfloor heating, which doubled as insulation and warmth. While the hypocaust was mainly for baths, some wealthy homes used it in their more luxurious bedrooms, because if you're going to be unconscious for 8 hours, why not do it on a toasty marble floor that screams "I've arrived"? Even windows were carefully considered. Romans used shutters, not glass. Thick, wooden, often decorated shutters that could be closed tight against noise, cold, or nosy neighbors trying to catch a glimpse of your toga collection. They'd block out light, sound, and judgment with one satisfying creak. Modern blackout curtains, please. These were blackout battlements, and if you were truly next-level elite, you might even have a separate sleep pavilion. Yes, a building just for resting. Romans loved compartmentalization, and nothing said wealth quite like walking a few steps from your main house to your dedicated nap palace, because nothing ruins the vibe of a luxurious snooze like having to sleep in the same room where you yell at your accountant. In short, Roman architecture didn't just aim for beauty, it protected sleep like it was on a sacred mission from Jupiter. Every stone, arch, and column worked overtime to turn chaotic city life into soft, echoless serenity. You could sip wine, lie back, and not hear a thing, except maybe the faint rustle of a palm branch or the whimper of your neighbor's ambitions fading into the stone. So next time you wake up at 3 a.m. because your upstairs neighbor dropped their third dumbbell of the week, think of the Romans. They weren't better sleepers just because of routine or mindset. They built their peace, one thick wall at a time. Before there were sleep apps, melatonin gummies, or overpriced pillows filled with shredded unicorn foam, there were herbs and wine, and a few concoctions that definitely would not pass modern health regulations. If you were having trouble sleeping in ancient Rome, you didn't reach for a bottle of Tylenol PM. You reached for a bundle of lavender, a jug of strong red, or if things got desperate, a priest with questionable credentials and access to poppy extract. The Romans believed in the power of nature to knock you out, and by believed, we mean relied heavily on a rotating cast of plants, oils, and vaguely magical substances to help them wind down at night. Whether you were a twitchy senator stressed about your rival's new toga, or just a tired farmhand whose bed was a sack of potatoes, Rome had a sleep aid for you. Side effects may have included drowsiness, mild hallucinations, or turning into a minor myth. Let's begin with the botanical superstar of ancient sedation, lavender, lavandula. Romans loved this stuff. They didn't just use it for sleep, they used it for everything. Baths, laundry, love spells, you name it, lavender got involved. It was thought to calm the mind, soothe the body, and make your bedroom smell less like foot sweat and more like a respectable temple offering. The wealthy burned lavender-scented oil in lamps, stuffed it into their pillows, and bathed in it, like it was the ancient version of self-care. You weren't fully relaxed until you were steeped, like a human teabag, in floral essence. Then there was poppy, beautiful, symbolic, and a little too effective. The Romans were well acquainted with the opium, derived from poppy plants, Papaver somniferum, which they used to treat everything from pain to insomnia to whatever Nero's personality disorder was doing that week. A few drops in wine or water, and suddenly your racing thoughts were as distant as a Gaulish rebellion. It was called hypnion in some texts, and while no one kept a dosage chart, just enough not to stop breathing was the general vibe. But poppy wasn't for peasants. It was expensive, risky, and very much something you might find in an apothecary's strongbox. For the average Roman, there were gentler options, like valerian root, chamomile, and passion flower, all used to create calming infusions. Valerian especially was prized for its earthy sedative power. Romans didn't quite know how it worked, but they agreed that if your dinner included a valerian brew, you'd be snoring before the dessert course, and you might dream of talking dogs or centaurs hosting game shows. And then there was wine. Oh, glorious, glorious wine. The Romans treated wine like water's cooler, more mysterious cousin. It wasn't just a drink, it was a delivery system for everything else. Sleep remedies, mix them into wine, medicinal herbs, stir them in, accidentally ingest a scorpion, drink enough wine to forget it ever happened. Wine was the original NyQuil, bold in flavor, red in hue, and occasionally spiked with questionable substances. In fact, there was a famous preparation called vinum somniferum, a sleep wine. Recipes varied wildly, depending on whether your doctor was a learned physician or your uncle who claimed a goat spoke to him in a dream. Common additions included myrrh's lettuce sap, henbane, and sometimes mandrake, a root so potent it bordered on mythological. Mandrake was known to induce sleep, trances, and the occasional brush with death if overused. So yes, ancient Romans were microdosing sleep. And speaking of lettuce, yes, lettuce was a Roman sleep aid, not the crispy Caesar salad kind, but a more wild and bitter variant, whose sap was believed to act as a mild sedative. Pliny the Elder swore by it. He probably didn't win many dinner parties, but he could fall asleep mid-sentence like a champion. Smells were just as important as potions. The Roman sense of scent was closely tied to sleep and health. People burned frankincense, myrrh, and cedarwood in their bedrooms, not because they were reenacting a nativity scene, but because these resins were believed to cleanse the air, calm the mind, and make you dream of pleasant things, like victory in battle, or not having to attend another poetry recital. Aromatherapy, Roman style, was both sacred and stylish. Of course, not all sleep aids were based on plant science. Some involved rituals, wearing amulets, reciting bedtime incantations, or placing special objects beneath your pillow. The most famous, the bulla, a protective charm often given to children, but occasionally worn by adults who were having a particularly rough week. If your dreams were haunted by angry ancestors, or that one statue that kept blinking at you, the bulla was your magical melatonin. And let's not forget the public bathhouses, which doubled as sleep prep centers. A visit to the thermae, with its hot pools, cold plunges, and terrifyingly vigorous massages, was practically designed to knock you out faster than a gladiator's right hook. Clean body, relaxed muscles, mild heat stroke, perfect setup for sleep. But perhaps the most Roman thing about their sleep aids was this. They didn't separate medicine from pleasure. You drank wine to sleep, but also to enjoy. You burned herbs for health, but also for ambiance. Their approach to rest wasn't clinical. It was sensory, ritualistic, and deliciously indulgent. Sleep wasn't a struggle. It was something you invited in with scent, taste, and just the right amount of poppy syrup. So no, they didn't have melatonin tablets or sleep podcasts hosted by whispering Scandinavians. But but they had lavender baths, sacred charms, and wine laced with valerian, and just a dash of pharmacological danger. If you passed out in Rome, it wasn't because you were optimizing your REM cycles. It was because your body, brain, and a small forest of herbs teamed up and said, "That's enough empire for today." If you've ever been violently yanked out of a dream by your phone screaming like a digital banshee, you've experienced the modern horror of the alarm clock, buzzing, beeping, chirping, blasting lo-fi music that somehow makes you angrier than heavy metal. But the ancient Romans, they didn't need it. Their alarm clock was the sun. That's it. Bright, bold, unignorable. No batteries, no snooze button, no passive-aggressive vibration under the pillow. Just a giant fiery orb in the sky that rose whether you liked it or not. And probably just as you were about to find out who you were marrying in that dream about a chariot race and suspiciously attractive centaurs, the Romans lived according to natural circadian rhythms, those lovely biological cycles you've heard of, but almost definitely ignored while doom-scrolling at 2 a.m. These rhythms were dictated by light and dark, and the Roman world, with its total lack of LEDs, screen glow or blinking Wi-Fi routers, ran entirely on nature's schedule. When the sun went down, activity faded. When the sun came up, life resumed. No buzzers required. Just sunlight, birds, and perhaps a rooster that didn't believe in personal space. And because everything hinged on natural light, Romans woke up early, very early. Even the word matutinus, which means early in the morning, comes from Matuta, a goddess of dawn. That's right, they had an entire deity devoted to morning people. She rose with the sun, opened the day's curtain, and kicked you in the toga until you got out of bed. Many Romans started their day at, or just before sunrise, around the first hour of daylight, which fluctuated with the seasons. Because fun fact, Roman hours weren't fixed. They divided the daylight into 12 hours, but those hours stretched or shrank depending on the time of year. In summer, the first hour might start around 5 a.m. In winter, you could get away with sleeping in until the luxurious hour of 7 o'clock a.m. if you weren't already freezing to death under a single threadbare blanket. This seasonal variation meant that Roman schedules were fluid, not rigid. There was no standardized 9 to 5. Instead, your internal sundial told you when to rise. Merchants opened their shops with the dawn. Farmers were often up before the sun, prepping tools or feeding animals. Even the courts and senate didn't start business until after sunrise, because no one was interested in debating grain tariffs in pitch darkness. If you needed help waking up, nature provided assistance. Birds chirped, dogs barked, oxen lowed, and somewhere in your neighborhood, a rooster was screaming like a caffeinated toddler with a drum set. This rooster was not optional. He lived nearby. He was loud. And unlike your phone, you couldn't silence him without getting into serious trouble with the local poultry priestess, or your neighbor, who loved that rooster like a child. A very feathery, shrill-voiced child. For those without birds, servants often did the waking. Wealthier Romans had household slaves whose job included making sure you got up in time for your bath, breakfast, or passive-aggressive Senate hearing. One nudge, one open shutter, and bam, you were face to face with the Mediterranean morning and whatever regrets you'd been trying to sleep off. Now, let's address the big myth. Did Romans use alarm clocks? Sort of, but not the kind you're thinking of. There were water clocks, clepsydre devices that measured time using the slow drip of water into a container. Some were incredibly sophisticated and could be rigged to release a whistle or bell when a certain volume was reached. These were used mainly in courts, speeches, or religious rituals to limit how long someone could speak. Looking at you, Cicero. But using one to wake up, extremely rare and deeply impractical, unless you wanted to sleep, next to what was essentially a leaking bucket orchestra. More common were sun-based time cues. Windows in Roman houses often faced east so that morning light would pour in and wake you up naturally. No blackout curtains, no do not disturb signs, just pure unfiltered sun to the face. Your brain would register the light, your body would start making cortisol, and your day would begin whether you were ready or not. Nature doesn't care about your hangover, and this wasn't just practical, it was healthy. Waking with the sun meant syncing your sleep cycle to the planet's rhythm. No blue light throwing off your melatonin, no scrolling Reddit until your soul detached from your body, just gradual light, a warming world, and a natural transition from dreams to duties. You didn't need to hack your circadian rhythm. You were your circadian rhythm. Even the Romans' daily routines supported this early rising. Their main meal, cena, came in the evening, but it wasn't an all-night binge. Most went to bed soon after dark, because lighting was expensive and terrible. No one was hosting late-night talk shows by oil lamp. Sleep came early, which meant waking up early was easy, even inevitable. And if you didn't get up on time, well, the consequences weren't great. Miss your slot at the bathhouse? Too bad. It's now full of sweaty politicians. Late to the forum? The best marble spots are taken. Arrive tardy to your job. Hammering bricks into an aqueduct. Congratulations. You're working double today. Roman society didn't reward night owls. It wasn't built for them. So while we shuffle through mornings fueled by caffeine and spite, the Romans greeted the day with sunlight, birdsong, and maybe a goat casually invading their atrium. No alarms, no apps, just a society synchronized to the sky. And yes, sometimes the wake-up call came from a rooster with unresolved rage issues, but at least he never needed charging. Let's get one thing straight. Romans didn't have better sleep because they were enlightened. They weren't meditating on mountaintops or sipping artisanal lavender moon tea under starry skies. They just didn't invent spreadsheets, push notifications, or that one life-ruining app that tells you how badly you slept while you were sleeping. And that's why they slept better. The collapse of natural sleep didn't happen in one catastrophic snooze button press. It was a slow, creeping disaster, like accidentally opening one too many browser tabs until your brain starts buffering. It began with industrialization, picked up speed with electric light, and finally threw in the towel when smartphones taught us that bedtime is the perfect time to solve all of life's problems at once, while horizontal, in the dark. In ancient Rome, nighttime was sacred. It meant rest, dreams, maybe a visit from Mercury, if he wasn't busy delivering divine gossip. Now, nighttime is when our anxieties host a jazz concert, and our phones light up like Roman candles. We've traded dream temples for Google Calendar alerts, and swapped sacred oils for questionable sleep influencers, selling melatonin toothpaste. Let's rewind a bit. The real downfall began with the Industrial Revolution. Factories didn't care if the sun rose or set. They cared about output. Shift work became a thing. Midnight became a perfectly normal time to start operating heavy machinery. Suddenly, sleep wasn't tied to sunlight. It was tied to the whims of corporate efficiency, a phrase which should itself be a sleep aid, because it's so profoundly soul-draining. The invention of the light bulb in the 19th century was the next nail in the sleep coffin. Don't get us wrong, it's nice to not bump into furniture after dark, but artificial light tricked our brains into thinking it was still daytime. Our precious melatonin, the sleepy time hormone of the gods, doesn't stand a chance against a 75-watt bulb, let alone a laptop screen, radiating anxiety and emails at 2 a.m. Now fast forward to the 21st century, where screens dominate every waking and nearly sleeping moment. Phones, laptops, TVs, smart watches that vibrate every time your friend's cat does something Instagram-worthy. The average modern person gets less sleep than their 19th century counterpart. And let's not even talk about the Romans, who probably clocked in a solid 8-9 hours without a single Bluetooth-connected distraction in sight. We don't just struggle with sleep quantity, we've absolutely nuked sleep quality. The average Roman wasn't falling asleep with a jaw clenched from Slack messages and a chest full of existential dread. They didn't dream of missed deadlines or accidentally texting their boss, "I love you." They dreamed of gods, omens, and maybe the occasional cheese-related nightmare. That's sleep content. And then there's stress. Modern life is stress on tap. Economic stress, social stress, climate stress. Your boss just emailed you, "Can we talk at 9 p.m. stress." The Romans had problems, sure, occasional invasions, occasional poisonings, but they weren't constantly inundated with a 24-hour news cycle designed to make sure you never ever feel safe enough to rest. Even our bedrooms are against us. They glow, beep, buzz, and track our every move. We now sleep with data. Your watch knows your heart rate, your REM cycles, and whether you drooled. Congratulations. You're a science experiment in your own bed. What the Romans had was boundaries, not just architectural ones. Stone walls, shuttered windows, the occasional decorative fountain, but mental ones. There was no email to check, no digital fire to put out. When the sun went down, so did expectations. They didn't need wind-down routines. The universe did it for them. Now we need apps to remind us to breathe. To be clear, we're not suggesting we all move into crumbling villas and start burning frankincense in our one-bedroom apartments. Although that does sound kind of fun. But we can admit we've lost something. Sleep is no longer sacred. It's scheduled, squeezed, and often sacrificed. We idolize people who only need 4 hours like they're productivity gods, when in reality, they're just one sleepless night away from crying in the shower over a dropped spoon. Ancient Rome didn't glorify sleep deprivation. They glorified the nap. So will we ever sleep like the Romans again? Probably not. We've invented too much. We've complicated it all beyond recognition. We live in a world where the sun no longer dictates our days, and our dreams are interrupted by Wi-Fi alerts and existential dread wrapped in an algorithm. But maybe, just maybe, there's something we can learn from our tunic-wearing, lavender-sniffing ancestors. Maybe we can carve out our own sacred spaces, quiet, dark, phone-free. Maybe we can treat rest not as weakness, but as the human necessity it always was. Because in the end, your ancestors dreamed of gods. You dream of group chats, and no offense, but one of those is way more restful. So tonight, put the phone down, turn off the spreadsheet, light a candle, if you must. And remember, the path to great sleep doesn't start in a store. It starts in the mind, the body, and maybe, just maybe, with pretending your bed is a Roman villa. Your pillow is stuffed with herbs, and your greatest worry is whether the toga you wore yesterday is too wrinkled for breakfast. Welcome to medieval Belgium. Now, today Belgium might be famous for waffles, chocolate, and surrealist art. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, Flanders was economic dynamite. Picture a land where wool meant wealth, beer counted as breakfast, and everyone had a mild to crippling distrust of the French. This wasn't some sleepy backwater of Europe. It was a booming region of cities, markets, guilds, and guild members, who were about one tax increase away from setting something on fire. Let's set the stage. Flanders was a patchwork of bustling medieval cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Kortrijk, full of hard-working artisans, burghers, and enough merchant guilds to make a Venetian jealous. The region owed much of its wealth to one thing: cloth. And cloth needed wool, mountains of it. England, back then basically a sheep farm with delusions of grandeur, exported wool to Flanders, where it was spun into some of the most luxurious fabric money could buy. This trade empire made Flemish cities filthy rich, and nothing invites outside meddling faster than a giant pile of money. Enter the French crown. To King Philip IV of France, Flanders looked like a gold mine inconveniently located just outside his direct control. Sure, the Count of Flanders technically ruled the region, but Philip considered it part of his broader French dominion, whether the Flemish liked it or not. Spoiler, they did not. The cities of Flanders were fiercely independent. Bruges and Ghent weren't just urban centres, they were medieval powerhouses. These cities had their own laws, militias, and in some cases, enough economic clout to thumb their noses at dukes, kings, and papal bulls. The merchant class, in particular, wasn't too keen on bowing to noble whims when they were the ones making all the money. This friction created what historians call feudal tension, but really it was more like a centuries-long shouting match with occasional swordplay. On one side you had French-backed noblemen who wanted to assert their authority, collect taxes, and remind the peasants who was boss. On the other, you had city guilds who believed, quite passionately, that their hard-earned florins should not be turned into wine goblets for some Parisian duke with a feathered hat and an allergy to manual labour. At the heart of this struggle was the Count of Flanders, a man who had the worst job in Europe, trying to please both the French king and his own subjects, and failing spectacularly at both. Count Guy of Dampierre found himself in a permanent state of political whiplash, caught between a French crown that treated him like a glorified tax collector and a citizenry that treated him like a traitor, any time he so much as smiled in French. It didn't help that the French crown was about as subtle as a trebuchet. Philip V began directly interfering in Flemish affairs, sending in officials, demanding more taxes, and trying to install French-friendly leaders in the region's cities. If Flanders was the cash cow, France was showing up with a bucket, a whip, and a recipe for butter. But here's the thing, the Flemish weren't just rich, they were angry, and they were organized. The city guilds, made up of blacksmiths, weavers, butchers, brewers, and other working-class folks, weren't your typical pushovers. These people ran the cities, trained in militias, and had a deep, simmering resentment of foreign interference. If you were a French noble strolling into Bruges expecting cheers and flower petals, you were far more likely to receive a brick to the head and a politely worded declaration of autonomy. Tensions reached a boiling point when Philip tried to arrest the Count of Flanders and installed his own governor, a French puppet named Jacques de Châtillon, to oversee the region. It was the medieval version of installing spyware on someone's trade network, and it went over about as well as a leper at a baptism. By 1302, Flanders had become a powder keg soaked in wine, wool, and wounded pride. The French thought they were dealing with uppity peasants. The Flemish thought they were dealing with arrogant occupiers. Both were wrong, but only one side brought horses to a swamp fight. So now the stage is set. A land of wealth, unrest, and the kind of civic pride that could sharpen a pitchfork. The cities were ready. The French were coming, and the mud was patiently waiting to ruin everyone's shoes. As they say in Kortrijk, welcome to Flanders, try not to drown. Before we dive into the swampy chaos of the Battle of the Golden Spurs, let's meet the glittering disaster waiting to happen. The French nobility, tall, proud, armoured to the eyebrows, and blessed with the unwavering confidence of people who'd never once had to consider whether pikes could be pointed upwards. The French knights marching toward Flanders in 1302 weren't just soldiers, they were living monuments to the feudal ego. These weren't the grizzled veterans of endless war. These were blue-blooded aristocrats, raised on tales of chivalry, divine right, and the firm belief that wars were won not through tactics, but through birthright, banners, and looking fabulous on a horse. And oh, the horses. French knights didn't just show up. They arrived with a personal parade of war horses, gold-trimmed armor, coats of arms that looked like medieval NASCAR sponsorships, and the sort of plumed helmets that screamed, "Subtlety is for peasants." By this point in history, the French knight had evolved into a social super-predator. He had one job: be noble and look dangerous doing it. Training began in childhood, when young boys of noble blood became pages, then squires, learning to ride, joust, hunt, and sneer at anyone without a last name that came with a D in front of it. By adulthood, they were a walking pile of steel and expectations, covered head to toe in mail or plate. They weighed more than a small ox, and often required a team of assistants just to get on their horse. The armor itself could cost a small fortune, making each knight basically a medieval Lamborghini with a personality problem. But beneath all the polish and pageantry was a fatal flaw. These guys believed their own hype. They subscribed to the idea that knights were God's chosen instruments of war, practically invincible on the battlefield. After all, what could possibly defeat a wall of armoured horsemen charging at full speed with lances lowered and war cries echoing over the hills? Spoiler: mud. Mud could do that, but we're not there yet. The French leadership in 1302 was commanded by Count Robert II of Artois, a man whose tactical approach can best be described as maximum horsepower, minimal foresight. A veteran of earlier wars, Robert still clung to the old-school belief that valor and noble blood were military strategies in and of themselves. In his mind, anything less than full-frontal mounted assault was cowardice, and unfortunately, a lot of knights agreed with him. This group wasn't exactly known for listening to scouts or double-checking the terrain. Why would they? They were the top of the food chain. Their enemy, after all, was a ragtag collection of weavers, brewers, and guys who knew their way around a pigsty. The French assumed this would be over in an afternoon, followed by a celebratory dinner, and maybe some peasant tax collecting as dessert. In fact, many of the knights reportedly brought extra wagons to carry home plunder from their expected victory. They weren't just confident, they were logistically prepared to win. It's the medieval equivalent of showing up to a street fight with your Instagram captions already written. And it wasn't just confidence in numbers, it was in class. The French military system was deeply feudal. Nobles were assumed to be inherently better at warfare, simply because of who their grandparents were. Their war councils often included more vanity than strategy, and orders were shouted down the chain by men who thought humility was a communicable disease. This class arrogance extended to the equipment too. Knights scoffed at infantry. Archers were useful but unimpressive. Pikemen were viewed as little more than scenery. The idea that a well-placed spear or a sharp pike could take down a knight, unthinkable. That would imply that warfare required brains, not just breeding. Even within their own ranks, there was a clear pecking order. Lesser nobles were expected to follow the lead of high-ranking aristocrats, regardless of whether those aristocrats had any idea what they were doing. Decisions were made based on prestige and honor, not battlefield conditions or, God forbid, listening to commoners. And speaking of honor, the knights were obsessed with it. Dueling, jousting, and other displays of personal prowess were considered more meaningful than cohesive military tactics. The French war machine ran on ego and inertia, both of which, as we'll see, have the turning radius of a barge. To them, the battle ahead was not a test of strategy, but a grand performance. They were here to dazzle, not adapt. They believed victory would fall into their laps like grapes from the heavens. Why wouldn't it? They were the finest cavalry in Europe, noble, proud, and deeply unfamiliar with the phrase, "Wait, is that a ditch?" But history has a sense of irony, and the French knights of 1302 were about to learn the hard way that valor doesn't help when you're face down in a bog and a cheesemaker with a pike is asking for your boots. If you had walked into Bruges or Ghent in early 1302, you probably wouldn't have guessed the people sharpening spears in alleyways and sketching battle maps on tavern tables were guild members, not seasoned warriors. Yet, within these bustling Flemish cities, a quiet revolution was boiling beneath the scent of hops and mutton stew, because when the French brought their knights, Flanders responded not with a standing army, but with a furious army of standing tradesmen. Let's begin with the secret weapon of the Flemish people, guilds. To the outside world, a guild was just a medieval version of a labour union. Bakers had their guild. So did butchers, blacksmiths, weavers, cobblers, brewers, candle makers, coopers, and even the guys who built barrels, a profession that existed solely to help the brewers sleep better at night. But inside Flanders, guilds were power structures, economic engines with teeth. They controlled trade, regulated standards, handled disputes, and crucially, trained their members in self-defense. Because when your city's entire textile output could be torched by one angry noble on a bad horseback ride, you learned to swing a pike between looms. The Flemish militia wasn't made up of peasant conscripts pulled from potato fields. These were urban townsmen, craftsmen, merchants, and skilled workers who knew discipline, teamwork, and the value of a well-placed hammer. Many had military training, especially those in Bruges and Ghent, where local militias acted as a civic defense force. They didn't just know how to fight, they knew how to organize. Think less angry mob with pitchforks, and more neighborhood watch with chainmail and detailed minutes. And they weren't alone. The movement had faces: Peter de Koninck, a weaver with more charisma than most nobles, and Jan Bredel, a butcher who reportedly swung an axe in battle with the same flair he used on pork. These two became folk heroes, not just for rallying the resistance, but for doing it as commoners. No crowns, no coats of arms, just guts, grit, and probably a lot of shouting. In Bruges, Peter de Koninck was a firebrand, rallying the working class and stoking the fires of anti-French sentiment. Like it was his second job, Jan Bredel was the muscle, symbolically and literally. The man wasn't born with a silver spoon, he was born with a cleaver. Together, they gave the resistance a kind of street-level leadership the French couldn't understand and certainly didn't respect. Which brings us to the organization of the Flemish army. While the French knights were busy polishing armor and rehearsing dramatic victory speeches, the Flemish were digging trenches, fortifying bridges, sharpening pikes, and yes, holding tactical meetings in beer halls. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising. This was battle strategy disguised as civic pride. Each guild provided its own men, weapons, and resources. They voted on leaders, coordinated positions, and trained like they actually intended to survive. They fought in tight formations designed to counter cavalry charges, rows of pikemen trained to work together like gears in a meat grinder. The French might have laughed at the idea of a cobbler in combat, but they weren't laughing when that cobbler locked shields and helped impale a horse mid-charge. What made this even more impressive was the speed. Within a matter of months, the Flemish transformed a merchant rebellion into a functional, well-coordinated fighting force. If it sounds like a miracle, remember, it wasn't. It was logistics. These were men who knew how to run complex systems, marketplaces, guild halls, entire economies. War, to them, was just another job with deadly customer service, and their motivations clear as day. The French weren't just outsiders, they were occupiers. French governors had raised taxes, pushed out local leaders, and stomped on everything the guilds held dear. This wasn't about glory, it was about independence, livelihoods, and revenge served with a side of tactical flanking. So while the French were preparing for a gallant clash of steel and honour, the Flemish were prepping trap-filled terrain, specialised weapons, and the kind of furious unity only seen when someone's beer trade is at stake. These commoners weren't supposed to win. According to every noble handbook ever written, battles were decided by whose armour shone brightest and whose horse neighed most majestically. But the Flemish had other plans involving narrow canals, wooden stakes, and a deep understanding that fighting dirty beats losing clean. Because when your cobbler starts studying flanking manoeuvres, it's time to worry. By the spring of 1302, Flanders was no longer simmering, it was boiling. Furious guildsmen were now hardened militia. City streets echoed with chants of rebellion, and the French crown was beginning to realize that their idea of peacekeeping was being interpreted as oppressive foreign occupation, with extra taxation and a side of humiliation. Shocking, really. To France, the growing Flemish resistance was like a bad rash, annoying, widespread, and impossible to ignore. And if history has taught us anything, it's that medieval kings rarely reached for ointment, they reached for armies. The last straw had come just weeks earlier in a city that was about to make headlines. Bruges. Once a thriving port of cloth and coin, it had become a crucible of rebellion. Tensions had already reached a fever pitch after the French-appointed governor, Jacques de Châtillon, began acting like Bruges was his personal fiefdom, and the townsfolk his mildly disobedient livestock. De Châtillon, tasked with keeping order in Flanders, approached his job with all the tact of a boot in a butter churn. He quartered French troops in the city, raised taxes, and began forcibly silencing anyone who didn't seem sufficiently grateful for French rule. Unsurprisingly, this went over with the locals, about as well as a fire in a wool warehouse. And then came May 18th, 1302, a date still known to this day as the Bruges Martins. Before dawn, armed Flemish guildsmen launched a surprise attack against the French garrison stationed in the city. The password for the operation, Schild and Vriend. Schild and friend. A simple phrase the French couldn't pronounce without sounding like they were gargling gravel, making it the world's deadliest tongue twister. The result? A massacre. Hundreds of French soldiers were slaughtered in their beds, in the streets, or while trying to flee. Jacques de Châtillon barely escaped with his life, galloping off into history with a very strong incentive never to visit Bruges again. To the people of Bruges, it was a victory. To Philip IV, the King of France, it was a national embarrassment of catastrophic proportions. Losing a garrison was one thing. Losing a garrison to guys who made sausages and wooden clogs, that was heresy. The king's response was swift and predictable. Crush them, all of them. Enter Robert II, Count of Artois. A seasoned noble, Robert was handed command of the punitive expedition with one mission: put Flanders back in its place, preferably under a very heavy French boot. Robert gathered an army fit for a royal smackdown. It was a who's who of French nobility, a rolling thunder of prestige, banners, and really impractical hats. By some estimates, over 8,000 soldiers were assembled, including roughly 2,500 heavy cavalry, the iron-plated juggernauts of medieval warfare. Knights from across France, including some from royal households, joined the campaign, eager to avenge their fallen comrades and remind the Flemish what social hierarchy looked like. Let's be clear, this wasn't just a military operation, it was a message written in sword steel and mailed directly to the face. France wasn't here to negotiate. France was here to demonstrate consequences, and they demonstrated loudly. The army marched with brutal efficiency, leaving scorched earth and broken morale in its wake. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were sacked. Crops were burned. Anyone caught speaking Flemish, a little too proudly, risked being labelled a traitor. This wasn't a military campaign, it was a medieval stress test, and Flanders was cracking. Kortrijk, a modest but strategically vital town, was soon chosen as the focal point of the next clash. The French planned to make an example out of it. They would break the resistance there, quickly, decisively, and with just enough theatrical flair to terrify the rest of the region into obedience, because nothing says diplomacy quite like catapulting your enemies into submission. But while the French were focused on spectacle, the Flemish were busy setting the stage. Secret meetings were held, weapons distributed, and field positions chosen with obsessive care. The resistance wasn't just running, they were preparing. Still, the French weren't worried. Why would they be? They were the strongest army in Western Europe. They had horses that cost more than Flemish houses, armor polished so bright it could blind you at sunrise, and nobles who believed God personally wanted them to win every engagement. The irony, their arrogance was practically audible. France decided the best way to deal with angry peasants was to stomp loudly through their front yard, waving swords and issuing ultimatums like they were handing out party invites. Unfortunately for them, the invitation had already been delivered, and the Flemish were planning a surprise party. Spoiler, there would be no cake. In warfare, there are flashy victories, and there are smart victories. The French knights were betting on the former. The Flemish, they were building the latter, one muddy footstep at a time. By mid-1302, the French army, bloated with nobility and gleaming with armor, was moving toward Cotric with all the grace and subtlety of an angry brass band. Their goal was to stomp the Flemish rebellion into the ground. But the Flemish had no intention of fighting on ground the French could stomp. Instead, they decided to fight where the ground would do the stomping for them. The region surrounding Cotric wasn't exactly a military paradise. No rolling fields for cavalry maneuvers. No clear, open plains where shiny armor could be shown off to maximum dramatic effect. What it did have, however, was swamps, muddy canals, wooden bridges, and an uncanny ability to swallow hooves whole. In short, it was a cavalry nightmare with excellent drainage issues. The Flemish took one look at the terrain and said, "Yes, perfect. Let's make this place worse." They selected a field just south of Courtrai near the Groningen stream, a spot that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated horses and loved ankle injuries. The battlefield was crisscrossed with natural irrigation ditches, soggy ground and narrow pathways, features that would normally make an army avoid it like the plague. But to the Flemish, it was home field advantage, especially if your opponent was expecting a runway and you gave them a muddy obstacle course instead. The first thing the Flemish did was dig more ditches, lots of them. These weren't the shallow trip-on-it-and-get-annoyed kind. They were deep, ankle-breaking trenches lined with water and concealed with brush. In other words, the medieval version of a banana peel in Mario Kart, but sharper, wetter, and likely fatal. Then came the pike formations. The Flemish army was heavily infantry-based, and they leaned into that strength with ruthless precision. These weren't spontaneous mobs with farm tools. They were organized militias, trained to hold formation shoulder to shoulder, with pikes long enough to kebab a horse before it reached striking distance. Each man knew his position. The formations were arranged in tight blocks, with men trained to brace their weapons against incoming cavalry charges. They'd practiced in city squares, drilled behind walls, and probably rehearsed while fermenting beer. These were coordinated units, not just guys with sharp sticks. Think ancient Greek phalanx, but with more body odor and political grievances. Behind the pikes came a second line, clubmen and axe-wielders, ready to finish off any unfortunate knight who made it through the first round of skewering. This wasn't just defense, it was calculated attrition, turning every foot of ground into a death trap. The Flemish also made sure the battlefield worked with them, not against them. Narrow paths funneled cavalry into tight clusters, marshy patches ensured horses couldn't build up momentum. Bridges were either destroyed or rigged for collapse, and the Groningen brook, it became both a boundary and a trap, a natural barrier that would later play a starring role in drowning French ambitions, literally. And then, of course, there was the weather. Flanders in July wasn't exactly sun and sangria. Even in summer, the region was prone to sudden rain, soggy fields, and the kind of humidity that made chainmail rust out of spite. The Flemish couldn't control the rain, but they counted on it, like a co-conspirator with a grudge against mounted knights. And as if on cue, heavy rains soaked the battlefield just days before the engagement, turning already wet terrain into a medieval slip-and-slide of doom. The French didn't know what they were walking into. Why would they? To them, the Flemish were just rebels to be steamrolled by heavy cavalry and noble flair. Terrain scouting was for people without a birthright. It never occurred to them that their enemy might be preparing an entire battlefield designed specifically to make their horses cry. The Flemish weren't trying to meet the French head-on in a glorious clash of chivalry. They were planning to break their charge, trap their knights, and let the mud and chaos do the rest. Their strategy didn't need to be elegant, it needed to be effective. And let's be honest, when your battle plan includes hope they fall in a ditch, you know you're cooking with medieval gas. But this wasn't desperation, it was intelligence weaponized by frustration. The people of Flanders were tired of being looked down on, taxed into oblivion, and treated like background extras in France's royal pageant. So they turned the landscape into a weapon. The terrain was their ally, the weather was their co-commander, and the mud. The mud was basically Flemish at this point. Everything was ready. The stage was set. The ditches were dug. The formations were in place. The only thing left was for the French to walk into the trap, wearing heavy armor, on expensive horses, with their egos polished to a mirror shine, and walk in. They would. The morning of July 11th, 1302 dawned, warm, damp, and deceptively calm. Birds chirped. The sun peeked through clouds, and somewhere near Korchik, an army of French knights was getting dressed like they were going to a royal gala. Not straight into a cleverly laid death trap. They polished their armor, they mounted their war horses, they checked their hair in reflective helmets, allegedly, and with all the confidence of people who'd never experienced consequence, they began marching into a battlefield designed to humiliate them. It began with the French deployment, led by Robert of Artois, a man who believed in two things, the nobility of war, and charging headfirst into things he didn't fully understand. The French army was split into three battles, medieval term for divisions. The vanguard, the main force, and a rearguard. Each contained a dangerous amount of pride, and critically, not a single guy whose job was to say, "Hey, should we scout this marshy terrain first?" They assumed the Flemish would panic, scatter, and flee, like peasants were supposed to. What they encountered instead was a fortified line of bristling pikes and deeply unimpressed townsmen, standing tight in ranks like they were guarding the last barrel of beer on earth. Now the French plan was simple: charge, crash, conquer. This was standard knightly procedure, and to be fair, it had worked on many occasions. Knights on horseback were the tanks of the medieval world, devastating when used correctly. Unfortunately, on this day, they were more like expensive lawn ornaments sinking into wet turf. The first charge was textbook overconfidence. French knights surged forward, lances lowered, banners flying, hooves pounding like thunder. It looked impressive. It sounded terrifying. But the minute they hit the narrow, sodden field with trenches hidden under reeds and mud that sucked at hooves like a cursed bog, the whole thing started unraveling faster than a wool tunic in a knife fight. Horses slipped. Lances missed. Knights collided with each other. Some fell into the concealed ditches and never got back up. Others were flung from their saddles by pike walls held steady by angry butchers who weren't impressed by noble titles or polished chainmail. The Flemish didn't budge. They didn't break. They stood like a human spike strip, and the knights were driving full speed into it. The French had expected a crowd of disorganized rebels. What they got was a wall of professional-grade resentment, reinforced by the kind of terrain that makes cavalry cry. As the initial wave buckled, Robert of Artois doubled down, rather than regroup or reassess. Two verbs rarely used by 14th century nobility. He ordered another full charge. This time, more knights piled into the fray, only to find themselves bottlenecked in swampy ground, hemmed in by canals, and completely unable to maneuver. Horses crashed into fallen comrades. Knights got tangled in each other's gear, and all the while the Flemish infantry stabbed, shoved and clubbed with grim coordination. The terrain funneled the French into a corridor of chaos, a kill zone where their advantages meant nothing. The knights couldn't spread out, couldn't flank, couldn't even turn around easily. They were being picked apart by people they wouldn't have invited to dinner. And just to make things worse, the mud, it clung to boots, jammed into armor joints, and sucked riders straight off their horses. Those who fell, often, never got back up. Not because they were dead immediately, but because they couldn't move in 100 pounds of steel while getting trampled by the next wave. It was, quite literally, a parade of disaster. Meanwhile, the Flemish line held firm, inching forward, using long pikes to unhorse knights like medieval forklift operators. Behind them, clubmen and axe-wielders finished the job. This wasn't glamorous combat. It was controlled brutality, and it was devastatingly effective. French commanders began to panic. The cohesion of their army shattered. Some tried to rally their men, others simply tried to escape. But even retreat was treacherous. The groaning brook, now swollen with runoff and choked with fallen men and horses, became a watery grave for many trying to flee. Several knights drowned in their armor, unable to keep their heads above water, or their pride above common sense. Among the dead was Robert of Artois himself, trampled in the confusion and struck down as he tried to push forward. His fall marked the psychological collapse of the French effort. What had begun as a confident march ended in a full-blown rout, with the Flemish driving them back one mud-covered, blood-soaked step at a time. And the aftermath? A field littered with armor, bodies, shattered lances, and one of the greatest humiliations in French military history. The French knights showed up for a parade. They got a swamp, a spear wall, and a free mud facial, and for dessert, public embarrassment that would echo across Europe. The battle was over, but the Flemish weren't done collecting souvenirs. If the Battle of the Golden Spurs was a theatrical performance, the French knights were the stars right up until Act 2, when the extras stole the show and rewrote the script with pikes. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how staggeringly effective the Flemish militia actually was. These weren't full-time soldiers. They weren't bred in castles or trained by aging swordmasters with dramatic scars. They were guildsmen, butchers, weavers, coopers, cobblers. Yet on that July battlefield, they fought with the cold precision of a professional army and the righteous fury of men protecting their beer supply. While the French cavalry floundered in ditches and decorum, the Flemish stood rock-solid in disciplined geometric formations. Their secret weapon? The Godindag. No, that's not a polite greeting. It's a spiked club on a stick. Imagine a morning star and a broomstick had a very angry child. That was the Godindag part. Spear, part hammer, and all personal space invader. Combined with long pikes and polearms, the Flemish infantry formed tight-packed hedgehog walls, bristling with sharp ends and bad intentions. But it wasn't just the weapons, it was how they used them. These guild-trained formations worked like a human machine. Men in the front lowered pikes to catch charging horses. The middle ranks held steady, and those behind them delivered crushing blows to any poor soul who got too close. And most importantly, they didn't break. That was the game changer. In medieval warfare, once a line broke, either due to fear, fatigue, or someone yelling, "Oh no, they've got a second line," a chain reaction of panic usually followed. The French were counting on that. But what they got instead were weavers with nerves of steel who stood their ground like they were guarding the last barrel of lambic. The longer the Flemish held, the more visible the cracks in French morale became. Because let's be honest, it's hard to feel invincible when a fisherman in wooden clogs just knocked your friend off a horse with a glorified broomstick, especially when that fisherman immediately goes back to formation like it's just another day on the riverbank. The psychological tide of the battle began to shift rapidly. At first, the French had treated the Flemish with aristocratic disdain, as if the idea of being challenged by commoners was a personal insult. But now, surrounded by comrades sinking into the mud, seeing banners trampled and noble blood mixing with ditch water, the illusion of superiority began to collapse. And when confidence cracks, strategy collapses right behind it. Some French knights tried to adapt, dismounting to fight on foot, but by that point, they were already surrounded, disorganized, and exhausted. Their plate armor, designed for short bursts of combat and dramatic posing, quickly became a steel coffin in the swampy terrain. Footing was treacherous, visibility was limited. Every step forward meant risking a pike in the ribs or a Godindag to the helmet. The Flemish, meanwhile, had home field advantage and a clear plan: hold the line, let the enemy wear themselves out, and then push forward with disciplined brutality. And push they did. As the day wore on, the militia began executing countercharges, short, controlled advances that shoved back the weakened French flanks. This wasn't chaotic, desperate brawling. It was tactical pressure, applied methodically by units that had trained together, fought together, and probably drank together afterward. And let's talk about communication, because it mattered. The French relied heavily on individual valor, shouted commands, and the assumption that the guy next to them knew what he was doing. The Flemish, they had guild leaders, acting as battlefield captains, coordinating unit movements, signaling flanking shifts, and keeping morale high. There's something chillingly efficient about a butcher yelling, "Hold the line," while wielding an axe he normally used on pigs. Even as the French tried to rally, they found themselves being slowly surrounded, pressed against trenches and the groaning brook behind them. Their own formations disintegrated as panic began to replace discipline. Horses thrashed, men fell, and the Flemish, they just tightened the noose, because the goal wasn't to fight nobly. The goal was to win, and make sure the French never forgot who broke their charge with a wall of peasants and pole-arms. By the end of the day, the myth of noble invincibility had been shattered on the spears of artisans and the courage of shopkeepers. The Flemish hadn't just survived, they had executed one of the most stunning infantry victories in medieval European history. They didn't need knights, they had each other, and a very efficient system of stabbing in unison. Every battle has a moment, the precise instant when things stop being a fight and start becoming a disaster with sound effects. For the French army at the Battle of the Golden Spurs, that moment arrived not with a thunderous crash or a heroic last stand, but with the soft, wet squelch of retreating knights realizing they were completely screwed. Let's set the scene. By midday on July 11th, 1302, the field near Kortrijk was a medieval scrapyard of shattered pride. French cavalry lay broken across ditches, armor glinting beneath layers of mud. Horses were exhausted, knights were bloodied, disoriented, and demoralized. The Flemish militia, those infuriatingly organized fishmongers and fabric merchants, had not only held their ground but were now pushing forward, one muddy boot at a time. The French command structure had already begun to unravel. Communications were a mess. Formations were non-existent. What remained of the vanguard was tangled in a swampy stew of fallen comrades, impassable canals, and a growing sense of existential dread. And then came the final straw, the death of Robert II of Artois. Robert, the French commander and poster child for "Let's just charge again," had led the main attack personally. Now finding himself surrounded, outnumbered, and suddenly reconsidering every life choice he'd made since breakfast, he attempted to escape, and in the grand tradition of medieval tragedy, he failed. There are conflicting accounts of how exactly he met his end. Some say he was dragged from his horse and clubbed, others that he drowned while trying to flee. But one thing's certain, he didn't make it. His death sent an unmissable signal through what was left of the French army. Run, and run they did. Except run is a generous term. What actually happened was a stampede of aristocracy, flailing toward every available exit. Some tried to retreat across the battlefield, others dove into the groaning brook, which by now was less a gentle stream and more a night-trapping soup of chainmail and panic. The brook, for those unfamiliar, was not an Olympic swimming pool. It was narrow, marshy, and clogged with the bodies of men and horses who'd fallen there earlier. Add to that the weight of full armor, often over 60 pounds per person, and you get what historians like to call a logistics problem, and what the French knights experienced as an impromptu drowning lesson. Many knights who made it to the water did not come back up. Those who tried to fight their way clear often did so with blunt swords, bent helmets, and no backup. The militia followed them relentlessly, not because they were bloodthirsty, but because they knew this was their moment to finish it. Years of oppression, taxation, and humiliation had culminated in this final, chaotic unraveling. And the Flemish weren't about to let the nobility slip away with just bruised egos. The rout became a farce. Knights screamed for help. Horses refused to move. Squires abandoned their masters. Entire banners dissolved as men ditched weapons to swim, crawl, or simply roll away from the carnage. Some French fighters tried to hide under corpses. Others tried bribing their way out with promises of ransom, forgetting that Flemish guildsmen weren't interested in cash. They were interested in not being conquered anymore. One noble even lost his horse, not physically, but emotionally. The beast panicked and bolted into a canal, leaving its owner to flounder after it, with all the dignity of a man chasing his last paycheck into traffic. By the time the sun began to dip behind a haze of dust and blood, it was over. The battlefield was strewn with thousands of French dead, many of them nobles. It's estimated that over 1,000 knights perished, a loss so severe that some noble lineages were wiped out entirely. To put that in perspective, in a society built entirely on inherited privilege, that's like deleting half the top results on the medieval version of LinkedIn. The Flemish, on the other hand, had suffered relatively few losses. Their lines had held, their tactics had worked, and their city butchers were now national war heroes. The contrast was staggering. The French army, built on arrogance, crumbled under pressure. The Flemish militia, forged in hardship and held together with discipline and hometown rage, had won not just a battle, but their dignity. And they did it without cavalry, without fancy heraldry, and without pretending their birth certificates made them better at stabbing. As for France, the loss wasn't just military, it was psychological. This wasn't supposed to happen. The peasant class wasn't supposed to be a threat. They were supposed to bow, pay taxes, and maybe cry a little when nobles rode past. But instead, they'd organized, outsmarted, and outlasted an elite army. It wasn't just a defeat, it was an existential crisis in full armor. So yes, the French knights came for glory. They left without their boots, their swords, or their dignity. And in many cases, without knowing which way was up. After the smoke cleared, the ditches stopped bubbling, and the last French knight had been pulled from a bog like a confused steel-plated turtle. The Flemish militia stood victorious, bruised, exhausted, and probably smelling like 3 kinds of swamp rot, but victorious. And then came the moment that would give the battle its iconic name. As the sun rose the next day, casting golden light across a field littered with shattered banners and bloated egos, the Flemish began collecting the one item every dead knight had in common: their golden spurs. Now, to understand why this mattered, we need to talk about medieval fashion statements. In the chivalric world of 14th century Europe, golden spurs weren't just fancy bits of riding gear. They were a literal badge of nobility, a shiny, jingling declaration that said, "I'm rich, I'm mounted, and I've been knighted by someone important who probably wears a fur hat indoors." Spurs were the medieval equivalent of Rolexes, but more stabby if you tripped. And the Flemish had just acquired a field full of them. Thousands of dead or captured French knights meant thousands of discarded spurs, symbols of aristocratic pride, now detached from their owners and piled like scrap metal by men who had just rewritten the rules of war. To the Flemish, this wasn't just cleanup, it was ritual. One by one, the spurs were collected. Some were yanked from corpses, others were sliced off with knives. A few were probably just yanked off boots, still twitching from last-minute regrets. There was no reverence, no ceremony. This was tactical accessorizing, not looting. A peasant might not own a sword, but by God, he now owned the golden reminder that he beat the system. And the collection wasn't quiet, it was triumphant. Once gathered, the spurs were taken to the city of Kortrijk, to the Church of Our Lady. There, in a stunning act of symbolic mic-dropping, the Flemish hung the golden spurs from the ceiling, hundreds of them, glinting in the candlelight like tiny halos of humiliation. It was equal parts reverent and smug, a holy flex unlike anything the medieval world had seen. This was more than decoration, it was a statement. Look what we did, and we did it in clogs. The church became a sanctuary of memory. Every spur represented a noble who'd fallen not to disease or time, but to a common man with a pole and a really bad mood. It transformed from a house of worship into a shrine of defiance. And visitors? Oh, they came. Pilgrims, rebels, poets, and patriots all paid homage to the place where gold didn't represent wealth. It represented earned victory. But the symbolism didn't stop there. The Battle of the Golden Spurs marked a shift in how people viewed class and combat. For centuries, warfare was thought to be the domain of the noble elite, those who could afford the horses, the armor, the training, and the smug facial expressions. But Kortrijk changed that narrative. Suddenly, cities and guilds across Europe started whispering, "If Flanders can do it, why can't we?" The spurs became a rallying cry, not just for Flemish independence, but for the idea that common people, if well organized and sufficiently annoyed, could stand up to empire. Flemish poets wrote about it. Flemish mothers named their sons after the commanders. Flemish dads told the story again and again until their kids said, "Yes, we know, Dad." The knights cried in the swamp. The battle even became a national myth, with some later historians treating it like divine proof that the Flemish were destined to resist tyranny. In truth, it was a mixture of tactics, terrain, and a truly astounding level of French overconfidence. But hey, never let the facts get in the way of a good national origin story. And while the French licked their wounds and scribbled some very awkward letters back to Paris, The Flemish celebrated with beer, bread, and the satisfaction of knowing that a man didn't need a title to make history, just a pike, a plan, and maybe a few sharp insults. The golden spurs remained in the church for centuries, until they were tragically looted by the French in a later conflict, because irony is never late to a party. But by then, the message had already been carved deep into Europe's memory. You can't trample people forever, especially not on soggy terrain, and especially not if their cobbler is now a certified night puncher. The year was 1302. The place, a muddy field near Kortrijk. The winners, a ragtag bunch of weavers, butchers, fishmongers, and other tradesmen whose day jobs involved far less stabbing. But after one glorious afternoon of teamwork, tactics, and tactical swamp deployment, the Flemish militia didn't just win a battle, they rewrote the unwritten rulebook of medieval warfare. And Europe paid attention, because up until this point, the idea of a commoner defeating a knight was basically fantasy. A peasant might throw a rock, maybe stab a soldier if he was very lucky and very fast. But entire armies of merchants standing their ground and defeating the most powerful cavalry force in Europe, that was new, that was terrifying, that was bad news. For anyone who thought shiny armor equaled divine invincibility. Let's talk military impact first. The Battle of the Golden Spurs sent shockwaves through military theory. For centuries, nobles had banked on the power of cavalry charges, a thunderous wave of mounted men in heavy armor breaking enemy lines through sheer momentum and intimidation. But Kortrijk shattered that illusion. Suddenly, infantry mattered. Tightly packed formations with pikes, spears, and coordination could stop even the most glorious charge. Professional mercenary foot soldiers, like the Swiss pikemen or the English longbowmen, would rise to prominence in the coming decades. Armies began reconsidering their reliance on knights and started incorporating disciplined footmen as essential parts of their strategy, all because a bunch of guild members in aprons held their ground in the mud. The aristocracy, they were stunned. If commoners could beat knights, what else were they capable of? Could they demand rights, autonomy, less taxes? Suddenly, being rich didn't feel quite as safe as it used to. Monarchs and nobles throughout Europe looked at their tax-paying subjects a little differently, and probably started being a bit nicer to the village blacksmith, just in case he had a spear hidden under the anvil. But the legacy didn't stop at battlefield tactics. The victory at Kortrijk became the foundation of Flemish national identity. Before 1302, Flemish pride was more about producing excellent wool and strong beer. After 1302, it was a legend. Songs were written, tapestries were woven, children grew up on bedtime stories about how Grandpa Jan and Uncle Peter made a French knight cry into his gauntlets. The Flemish began to see themselves not as a fringe territory of the French crown, but as a people with backbone, as citizens, not serfs. And while full independence wasn't immediately won, the psychological impact was irreversible. This was a rallying cry that echoed for generations. Every future Flemish rebellion, every independence movement, every stubborn act of regional resistance would invoke the Battle of the Golden Spurs like a holy reference manual. And the name itself, that came not from a noble decree or royal historian, but from the gleaming trophies collected from the French dead. Those golden spurs now suspended from a church ceiling, as if heaven itself wanted a reminder of the day the underdog bit back. Even centuries later, European commanders still studied the tactics used at Kortrijk. Napoleon's own generals acknowledged the battle as a turning point in how infantry strategy evolved, and historians today still use it to illustrate the fragile ego of medieval nobility and the incredible potential of organized commoners. In short, the ripple effects of this muddy little battlefield reached every marble corridor of power in Europe. From England to the Holy Roman Empire, nobles began rethinking their attitudes toward both warfare and the people who made their boots and baked their bread. But perhaps the most important legacy is this: the myth of nobility was cracked, because after Kortrijk, everyone from the lowest servant to the highest duke knew that a knight could fall, and that when he did, a peasant might be the one holding the spear. So yes, kings might still wear crowns, lords might still throw feasts, but somewhere in the back of their minds, they now heard the faint sound of spurs clinking in a church in Kortrijk, and remembered that glory could be lost in the mud to a cobbler with good footwork and bad intentions. And the people they remembered too, because nothing quite boosts morale like the story of how your ancestors turned a knight's shiny ego into a cautionary tale and hung it from the rafters for everyone to admire. The Italian Renaissance, a glorious era when humanity rediscovered art, science, and the fact that rich people will always find a way to ruin everything. Picture it, late 1400s, Italy. The skyline is dotted with domes and bell towers. The air smells faintly of fresco paint and conspiracy, and the most powerful entity in Europe isn't a king or emperor, it's the Catholic Church. And make no mistake, this wasn't the humble barefoot church of early Christian martyrdom. Oh no, this church had golden ceilings, marble staircases, and a real estate portfolio that could crush empires. Think less mystical shepherds and more religious Fortune 500. The Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was CEO of Christ Incorporated, wielding divine authority and diplomatic clout like a scepter dipped in holy water and tax revenue. The Vatican was the most lucrative and politically explosive seat of power on the Italian peninsula, and every noble family wanted a slice of that heavenly pie. Italy itself was a patchwork of wealthy city-states: Florence, Milan, Venice, Naples, the Papal States, each ruled by ambitious dynasties, backstabbing politicians, and at least one cousin named Ludovico who kept poisoning people. The Renaissance may have given us Leonardo da Vinci, but it also gave us enough assassinations to fill a Netflix series every week. And into this vibrant, volatile, silk-draped storm walked Rodrigo Borgia. Now, Rodrigo didn't stumble into the church from a monastery with nothing but a cross and a calling. He entered it like a man who'd read the job description and decided to do it better, dirtier, and more profitably than anyone else. Born in Spain in 1431, Rodrigo was technically the nephew of Pope Calixtus III, because nepotism in the Catholic Church has been around longer than Latin. This family connection catapulted him into the higher ranks of the clergy, faster than you can say simony, which coincidentally is the word for buying your way into church office, which Rodrigo did, a lot. As a young cardinal, Rodrigo Borgia quickly earned a reputation for being well-connected, well-dressed, and very well-versed in both diplomacy and debauchery. He wasn't content with simply being part of the system. He wanted to run the show, and he understood that in Renaissance Italy, running the show meant playing the long game: alliances, marriages, favours, and occasional scandalous parties that somehow still required incense. But here's the thing, Rodrigo wasn't an idiot. He was brilliant, charismatic, educated, multilingual, and capable of reading a room, while also scheming to buy the room next door. He was the kind of man who could give a sermon in the morning, throw a feast at noon, and broker a secret treaty by dinner, all while dodging rumours that he had fathered 4 children and a small uprising, and everyone knew who he was. Rodrigo Borgia was the Renaissance's answer to a tabloid celebrity. If social media had existed in 1470, he'd have trended daily, #blessed and corrupt, #thirsty for power, and #holy daddy issues. He wasn't particularly subtle about his wealth, either. While many cardinals cloaked their greed in Latin phrases and soft hymns, Rodrigo strutted through Rome in tailor-made velvet, throwing lavish banquets that made Dionysus look like a picky eater. His homes were packed with art, wine, and the unmistakable vibe of someone who had mastered the art of being devout only when the camera was rolling. But perhaps his most valuable asset wasn't his money, his charm, or his noble bloodline. It was his patience. Rodrigo didn't rush to the top. He bided his time, climbing the clerical ladder one bribe, alliance, and dramatic prayer at a time, because Rodrigo Borgia understood what few others truly grasped. The papacy wasn't a spiritual office, it was a throne guarded by tradition, surrounded by sharks, and propped up by gold, and all he had to do was wait for the right moment to claim it. So while Florence was humming with the genius of Botticelli, and Michelangelo was sketching the blueprints for ceilings that would later ruin his neck, Rodrigo Borgia was sharpening his political knives, building a power base, and rehearsing his papal smile in the mirror. He wasn't just a man of God, he was a man of God-level ambition, and the Vatican? It had no idea what was coming. By the mid-15th century, Rodrigo Borgia had made it clear that he wasn't just some background choir boy in the grand opera of Renaissance Rome. He was holding the score, and quietly rewriting the lyrics. Still in his 30s, he had already achieved what many spent lifetimes chasing, the title of cardinal, which in the Renaissance church wasn't so much a divine calling as it was a political jackpot with velvet drapes and dinner privileges. Rodrigo wasn't subtle about how he got there. His uncle, Pope Calixtus III, had flung holy titles at him, like Mardi Gras beads from a papal balcony. Rodrigo became a bishop, then archbishop, and by 1456, at the ripe age of 25, he was officially wearing the red hat of a cardinal. He hadn't earned it through piety or scholarship, but through good old-fashioned nepotism, which back then was considered more of a lifestyle than a scandal. Still, once he had the title, Rodrigo didn't sit back and coast. He got to work, because being a cardinal in the 15th century wasn't just about lighting incense and nodding solemnly during Mass. It was about influence, connections, power. The cardinalate was a chessboard, and Rodrigo moved his pieces with the precision of a man who knew where every bishop was buried, and who put them there. Soon, Rodrigo became Vice-Chancellor of the Church, essentially the Vatican's chief operating officer. It was a job that combined diplomacy, finance, and occasionally whispering, "Forgive me, Father, for I've just restructured your tax plan." It also came with massive perks, control over appointments, access to church funds, and a front-row seat to every juicy piece of papal gossip. And Rodrigo used it to build an empire within an empire. He handed out lucrative offices to friends, appointed allies to cushy church jobs, and set up an entire network of loyalists who owed him favors and gold. If there had been a medieval LinkedIn, his connections page would have crashed under the weight of bribes and backdoor deals. But perhaps Rodrigo's most famous and infamous talent was his ability to wear two faces at once. In public, he was the polished cardinal, refined, eloquent, and excellent Latin speaker, with a talent for church law and the patience of a man waiting for just the right lightning strike from heaven to justify his next promotion. He could give sermons that would make saints weep, negotiate peace between warring nobles, and sit in judgment of sin with a face that said, "I am disappointed, but piously, in private." Let's just say that Rome's party scene in the 1470s had a very enthusiastic guest list, and Rodrigo's name was often near the top. He owned multiple properties around Rome, including villas that were less prayer retreat and more Renaissance rave den. One of his homes was notorious for hosting gatherings that included music, wine, professional companionship, and the kind of activities that would have made Saint Peter leave the keys to heaven and walk briskly away. Rodrigo fathered at least 7 children, though the exact number is as fuzzy as the moral compass that allowed him to do it while still preaching celibacy. His most famous offspring, Cesar and Lucrezia Borgia, would later become poster children for Renaissance scandal in their own right. But at this stage, there were just the very awkward reminders that Rodrigo Borgia was a man who believed in both fertility and plausible deniability, and yet none of it stuck to him. The thing about Rodrigo was that he played the game so well, even those who hated him couldn't help but respect his strategic genius. He didn't just survive in the cutthroat world of church politics, he thrived. He made alliances with the Orsini and Colonna families, brokered favors across Italy, and kept detailed records of who owed him what. To the public, he was a steady, reliable cardinal. Behind the scenes, he was stacking influence like gold coins in a Florentine counting house. What made it even more impressive was that Rodrigo knew exactly where the moral lines were, and exactly how to dance just next to them without getting burned. He bribed people, yes, but never left evidence. He took lovers, but always made sure to confess. Eventually, he enriched his friends, but never quite did it loudly enough for the papal court to react. He was the kind of cardinal who would forgive your sins for a price, and then ask for a receipt. At this point, Rodrigo wasn't yet pope, but he was already living like one, plotting like 10, and collecting favors like relics. Every feast, every handshake, every whispered deal was another brick in his stairway to St. Peter's throne. And trust him, he fully intended to sit in that chair, not because he was called by God, but because he'd already bought the cushion. When Pope Innocent VIII finally gave up the ghost in 1492, the papal throne was once again up for grabs. And just like clockwork, the conclave became less about holy inspiration and more about unmarked sacks of gold quietly changing hands behind heavy velvet drapes. It's important to remember that back then, a papal election wasn't just a spiritual event, it was the Super Bowl of corruption. Cardinals locked themselves away in the Sistine Chapel to supposedly wait for divine guidance. But the only smoke rising from the chimney came from burned voting slips, and the sheer friction of deal-making. And Rodrigo Borgia, he didn't wait for the Holy Spirit to whisper in anyone's ear. He shouted in gold. At this point, Borgia had been vice-chancellor of the church for over 3 decades. He knew every cardinal's weakness, who liked property in Naples, who owed debts, who was quietly stashing mistresses in countryside villas. He entered the 1492 conclave, not as a candidate, but as a seasoned auctioneer in a red hat. His campaign was simple: buy everything that wasn't nailed to the altar. Votes were purchased with promises of land, titles, money, and influential offices. One cardinal was allegedly promised 4 castles and a promotion. Another was gifted a palace and a very nice mule. Hey, Renaissance luxury had range. Borgia spread the wealth with the enthusiasm of a man who knew exactly how much it cost to become God's chosen representative, and had brought exact change. And it worked. On August 11th, 1492, Rodrigo Borgia officially became Pope Alexander VI. The papal throne now belonged to a man who treated the conclave like a Renaissance Costco. Buy in bulk, get rewards, walk out as Pope. White smoke rose from the chimney, signalling to the outside world that a new shepherd had been chosen. Inside the chapel, there were probably a few cardinals double-checking their receipts. Europe's reaction? Whiplash. To some, it was horrifying. A known womanizer and father of multiple children had just claimed the highest office in Christendom. To others, it was impressive. A masterclass in power politics wrapped in silk robes and Latin prayers. Even his enemies had to admit it. The man played the game like a virtuoso. They hated him, but they couldn't stop watching. It was like if Machiavelli got a job as the Dean of Theology. But Alexander VI didn't waste time pretending to be someone he wasn't. From day one, he made it clear. This papacy would be a Borgia papacy. Lavish processions, extravagant feasts, appointments of loyal friends and family. His reign began, not with quiet devotion, but with the Renaissance version of a fireworks display set to dramatic Gregorian chant. He handed out church offices like candy at a papal parade. His son, Cesare Borgia, was made an archbishop at just 15. Other children were legitimized, positioned, and promoted like bishops in a very unholy game of chess. Church property shifted hands faster than relics at a relic swap market, all orchestrated from the Borgia inner circle. What's more, Alexander VI didn't even seem embarrassed. If anything, he leaned into it. When critics whispered that the papacy was becoming a den of sin, he responded with more construction projects, more ceremonies, and even more decorative fountains featuring his family crest. It wasn't denial, it was branding. To him, the papal seat wasn't just a spiritual office. It was the ultimate prize, a Renaissance megaphone for the Borgia name. And for once, it wasn't being held by a fragile old priest with gout. It was held by a political shark in a papal tiara. Still, even for all the cynicism, there was something undeniably magnetic about Alexander VI's rise. He represented the full glory and depravity of Renaissance power. The collision of wealth, politics, and religion, wrapped in gold thread and half a dozen morally questionable decisions. Was he the most pious pope? Not even close. Was he effective? Terrifyingly so. And did he stop at just buying the papacy? Oh no, he was only just warming up, because the Vatican was now Borgia territory. And under Alexander VI, the keys to the kingdom weren't just metaphorical. They came with property rights, a side of nepotism, and probably a complimentary mistress. The moment Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI, he made something very clear: this papacy came with a +1. Actually, make that +20, because where Alexander went, the entire Borgia clan followed: sons, daughters, cousins, secretaries, suspiciously well-dressed nephews, and probably a guy named Fabrizio, who no one ever officially introduced, but always had a sword. Welcome to the Vatican's awkward family phase. Let's start with the star players, Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, 2 names that history books whisper with a mixture of awe, scandal, and the vibe of a Renaissance soap opera that's gone off the rails in the best way possible. Cesare Borgia. Ah yes, Cesare, Alexander's golden boy, or maybe his dark prince, depending on whether you caught him in the church or on a battlefield. originally destined for the clergy, because every power-hungry teenager loves celibacy and Latin. Cesare was made a bishop at 15, and a cardinal not long after. But even dressed in crimson robes and dripping with holy titles, Cesare had the energy of a man who would rather be stabbing someone in Milan than attending Vespers. He hated being a churchman, and Alexander VI, in his infinite sure, why not, wisdom, eventually allowed him to resign his cardinalship so he could fully lean into his true calling: political murder and military conquest. Cesare was handsome, charismatic, ruthless, and probably carried more knives than a Roman cutlery store. He would become one of the most feared military commanders in Italy. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Lucrezia Borgia. Lucrezia, the Pope's daughter, was less about swords and more about strategy, though her legend has unfairly painted her as part poisoner, part temptress, and part innocent pawn. In truth, she was likely all three depending on the year. What we do know, she was married off repeatedly for political gain. Each wedding a calculated move on Alexander's ever-shifting chessboard. She was intelligent, educated, fluent in several languages, and if gossip is to be believed, once owned a hollow ring used to pour poison into drinks. Whether or not that's true, it certainly felt true to everyone in Rome, which, during the Renaissance, was enough. She was also the subject of incredible rumors: incest, murder, secret babies, cursed weddings. Historians today are still sorting fact from fan fiction. But in her father's court, Lucrezia was more than just a pawn. She was the Borgia family's diplomatic missile in a silk dress. Nepotism as a religious value. Once Alexander VI had the keys to the Vatican, he transformed the church into the Borgia family business. He didn't just hand out favors, he flung titles like medieval Oprah. You get a bishopric, you get a dukedom, everybody gets a principality. Cousins were made cardinals, sons were given armies. Lucrezia's husbands were gifted entire regions of Italy, until they outlived their usefulness. If there was a door in the papal palace that didn't have a Borgia nameplate on it, it was probably just waiting for a new coat of paint. The result? The Vatican became less a spiritual institution, and more like a family reunion, hosted in a very expensive murder mystery party. Sycophants swarmed the halls, rivals vanished, or accidentally died. Nobles who once sneered at the Borgia name now nervously kissed the Pope's ring while hoping Lucrezia didn't smile too widely. And as the Borgias rose, Rome descended into glorious theatrical chaos. Whispers of orgies, poisonings, and political executions filled the alleys and echo chambers of every cathedral. Whether the rumors were true didn't even matter anymore. What mattered was that everyone believed the Borgias could do anything and get away with it, and often they did. Because Alexander VI didn't just tolerate his family's behavior, he weaponized it. Cesare became his enforcer, Lucrezia his diplomat, and the rest of the clan his web of influence stretched across every corner of Italy. The irony, while the Borgias were busy using the church as a ladder to power, they were still performing their religious duties. Masses were held, sermons were delivered, papal bulls were issued condemning sin, usually while Alexander's mistress waved from the courtyard. But to the Borgias, none of this was hypocrisy. It was strategy. The church wasn't a sanctuary, it was a throne room. And in the house of Borgia, God may have been watching, but he wasn't running the show. If Renaissance Rome had Yelp, the Vatican under Pope Alexander VI would have had a solid 5 stars for scandal, 4 for decor, and maybe 1 for actual holiness, depending on how recently someone had been poisoned. Because if there's one thing the Borgias knew how to do, aside from throw legendary dinner parties, it was blur the line between rumor and reality so thoroughly that even the corpses probably weren't sure what had happened. Let's start with the whisper that echoed through every candle-lit corridor and perfumed salon in Italy. Poison. To the Borgias, poison wasn't a tool of cowardice. It was an art form. And while hard evidence is scarce because smart poisoners don't leave labels, the reputation stuck. The family was rumored to own a legendary concoction called cantarella, supposedly a slow-acting, tasteless poison that could be slipped into wine, soup, or maybe even the Eucharist, depending on the vibe. Enemies of the papacy, especially those who stood in the way of Alexander's ambitions, had a funny habit of developing mysterious illnesses right after a friendly dinner. Cardinals who questioned his reforms, dead. Nobles who threatened Lucrezia's marriages, also dead. A few of them even had the decency to die in public. Just to make the message clear, was Alexander personally slipping poison into goblets like a twisted sommelier? Probably not. But did he nod approvingly when Caesar did? Almost certainly. This was, after all, a man who could deliver a sermon on Christian mercy in the morning and attend a secret execution by sunset without smudging his robe. And speaking of robes, Alexander often removed his, because if the papal throne came with a vow of chastity, Alexander VI must have lost that page of the Bible on purpose. His love life was less celibate shepherd and more retired rock star with diplomatic immunity. His most famous mistress was Venosa di Catanei, a Roman noblewoman with whom he had 4 children. Not spiritual children, literal, biological, name them after uncle's children. And while most popes kept their indiscretions hush-hush, Alexander gave Venosa land, homes, and a seat at the Vatican-adjacent social table. She was the unofficial First Lady of the Papal States, and everyone knew it, but Venosa wasn't the only one. Later in his reign, Alexander took up with Julia Farnese, a young noblewoman known to the Roman elite as Julia la Bella, Julia the Beautiful. Her relationship with the Pope was so blatant that artists depicted her as the Madonna, with Alexander's features showing up as Saint Joseph, which feels less like divine inspiration and more like awkward fan art. Even his enemies admitted that Alexander's mistresses were refined, intelligent, and gorgeous. If he was going to scandalize the church, he at least had the good taste to do it in style. Arranged marriages, mysterious disappearances, and suspicious accidents were all part of the daily Vatican bingo card. Lucrezia Borgia, his daughter, was used as a diplomatic chess piece, married off to secure alliances, then remarried when those alliances soured. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was strangled in the Vatican after surviving an earlier assassination attempt. The Borgia family insisted it was a tragic misunderstanding. Rome shrugged and ordered another bottle of wine. And then there was one Borgia, Alexander's favorite son, until he turned up floating in the Tiber River, with multiple stab wounds. The official story was that it was a random attack. The unofficial story, Tixeri probably did it, and Alexander, heartbroken for about 5 minutes, and then moved on with a renewed focus on César's military career. Even the clergy started looking over their shoulders. Priests who crossed the Borgias were demoted, exiled, or retired early. Cardinals aligned with rival families mysteriously developed terminal cases of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And all the while, Alexander maintained an image of calm spiritual authority, hosting ceremonies, issuing bulls, and occasionally condemning sin, just, not his. To the outside world, the Borgia papacy was a walking contradiction, a reign of sacred rituals and deadly schemes, candlelit prayers and secret passageways. It was horrifying and weirdly captivating, because while many Romans feared Alexander VI, some quietly admired him. He was bold, decisive, stylish, effective. And in an age of weak popes and endless war, a little poison and scandal started to look like good management. Rome's reaction wasn't so much burn the heretic as it was, yes, he's terrible, but have you seen the parties? Under Alexander VI, morality became a matter of convenience, murder became negotiation, and mistresses became tradition. The Borgia Vatican wasn't so much corrupt as it was efficiently decadent, and at the heart of it all sat a man who could bless your baby, marry your daughter, and poison your uncle, all before lunch. By the late 1490s, Pope Alexander VI had officially completed his spiritual glow-up into a military boss with a cassock and a conquest checklist. The Vatican wasn't just a seat of spiritual guidance anymore, it was now a war room, and the Pope wasn't just handing out blessings, he was handing out marching orders. Because when you're a Renaissance Pope with absolute power and a son like Caesar Borgia, it's only a matter of time before your Sunday sermons turn into military campaign briefings. Let's back up. The Italian wars were already underway, and Italy was the board game everyone wanted to play, even though no one really knew the rules. France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Venice, Naples, Milan, all the big names were taking turns invading, backstabbing, and drawing new maps every Tuesday. And smack in the middle of it, all sat Alexander VI, adjusting his papal tiara and thinking, you know what this needs, more Borgia. Alexander's plan was cunning. Use the chaos of international war to expand papal territory and make the church not just a spiritual authority, but a real, boots-on-the-ground Renaissance superpower. And he had the perfect general for the job, his son César, now officially freed from his cardinal duties, because holy orders are apparently reversible when politics are involved. César became a duke, a warlord, and the Vatican's new favourite form of divine intervention. He just happened to carry it out with swords and trebuchets, armed with troops, papal funds, and more ruthlessness than a vengeful Roman senator. César launched a series of brutal military campaigns across central Italy. His mission: reclaim rebellious territories, eliminate rival families, and carve out a mini-empire for the Borgia name, all under the papal banner. Because nothing says Christ's vicar on earth like sending your son to burn down a city. César didn't do subtle. When he wanted a fortress, he took it. When a local noble resisted, he negotiated, usually just long enough to get within stabbing distance. His enemies often didn't see him coming. Those who did often wished they hadn't. Cities like Faenza, Urbino, and Rimini fell to César's armies with terrifying efficiency. He used speed, brutality, and the psychological warfare of being both a Borgia and backed by God's earthly representative. Imagine being a small-town mayor and hearing that the Pope's son was heading your way, not to pray, but to annex your house. These weren't mere skirmishes. César waged total campaigns using mercenaries, spies, and diplomacy with the same cold calculation. He made alliances with the Orsini and Vitelli families, then later crushed them when they became inconvenient. His word was worth less than a Florentine banknote during a plague. He charmed, betrayed, and decapitated his way through central Italy, all while looking absurdly fashionable. And through it all, Alexander cheered from the sidelines, like a dad watching his kid play Little League. If Little League involved siege weapons and political assassinations. But this wasn't just a family power trip. Alexander had a vision: a unified papal states, free from meddling barons and rival claimants, ruled by Borgias and loyalists, bound not just by faith, but by fear and loyalty bought in blood. This was the first papacy in history that treated military conquest as holy duty. Popes before him had raised armies in defense. Alexander raised armies in pursuit of real estate, enemies of the church, and by church we mean Alexander personally, were systematically eliminated. Accusations of heresy were often replaced with simpler strategies, like send César or invite them to dinner, then don't let them leave. Papal bulls were drafted by day, death warrants signed at dusk. And how did the rest of Europe respond? With the same exhausted awe you'd give to someone who walks into your chess match and flips the board. The kings of France and Spain were both fascinated and alarmed. On one hand, here was a pope consolidating power like a secular monarch. On the other hand, he was doing it with sacraments in one hand and a sword in the other. Even Machiavelli took notes, literally. His admiration for César Borgia was so intense, he later used him as the blueprint for the prince. Yes, the book that teaches you how to lie, manipulate, and rule with an iron fist was inspired by the guy who got his job after being fired from God's clergy. By the early 1500s, the papal states had grown larger, the Borgia name loomed darker, and the Vatican had more armour in its basement than relics. What began as a spiritual crusade had become an empire with incense and murder permits. Alexander wasn't just the Pope, he was the warlord of Christendom. On the evening of August 17th, 1503, Pope Alexander VI did what he rarely did. He got sick, stayed sick, and didn't get back up. He had just enjoyed a meal with his son Cesare and a cardinal in a villa outside Rome. Within hours, everyone at the table fell violently ill. Was it food poisoning, malaria, or, in this being the Borgia family, it's always an option, a little bit of, oops, wrong goblet? According to some accounts, the Borgias had prepared a poison for a cardinal they wanted dead, but accidentally drank it themselves. That's right, in the most Borgia twist imaginable, they may have poisoned their own dinner party. Picture it, César and the Pope coughing up blood, while the servants try to figure out whose wine was supposed to kill whom. Alexander lingered for days in sweaty, grotesque agony. Rumours swirled that his body swelled, blackened, and reeked so badly, the Vatican had to wedge him into a coffin like a bloated sausage. That could be exaggerated, but Renaissance Rome loved a dramatic death story. Either way, August 18th, 1503, marked the end of Alexander VI, and the beginning of a frenzied Borgia unravelling. Without their patriarch, the Borgia Empire started crumbling faster than a badly mortared basilica. Caesar, gravely ill at the time of his father's death, barely had the strength to hold on to power. He tried desperately to control the conclave that would elect the next pope, hoping to install a friendly face and continue Borgia dominance. But without Alexander's charisma, political genius, and endless vault of bribes, Caesar found himself sidelined fast. The new pope, Pius III, lasted only 26 days, but the next one, Julius II, was everything the Borgias weren't: stern, militaristic, and eager to scrub the Vatican clean of what he saw as Borgia filth. Caesar was stripped of titles, imprisoned, and exiled. Within just a few years, the once unstoppable Borgia machine had gone from papal juggernaut to historical cautionary tale. And Lucrezia, she fared better than her brother. After surviving a few too many marriages, she reinvented herself in Ferrara as a refined duchess and arts patron, putting distance between herself and her scandal-ridden family. History couldn't decide whether to paint her as a victim or a viper, but either way, she lived long enough to see herself become a legend. And in Renaissance Italy, that was a win. So what do we make of Pope Alexander VI, this sinner in silk, this holy man with a hit list? This pope, who turned the Vatican into a palace of pleasure, power, and thinly veiled threats. To his critics, Alexander was the embodiment of corruption. He broke every rule the papacy was supposed to uphold. He had mistresses, he fathered children, he sold offices, waged wars, and weaponized the church for personal gain. His reign was the final straw that triggered the disgust of thinkers like Erasmus and helped fuel the Protestant Reformation. To his admirers, however, and yes, there were some, Alexander was a master of realpolitik, a pragmatic leader in a chaotic time who kept Rome stable, filled the church's coffers, and played the game better than anyone else. He wasn't holy, but he was effective. And in the jungle of Renaissance politics, effectiveness sometimes trumped ethics. Even Niccolò Machiavelli, who rarely gave out compliments unless knives were involved, called Cesare Borgia the ideal prince. And Cesare was Alexander's creation, shaped by his power, protected by his ambition. In the end, Alexander VI left behind a mixed legacy soaked in incense and intrigue. He proved that a pope could be more Caesar than saint, more kingmaker than shepherd. His tomb may have been modest, unlike the life he lived, but the scandals he left behind were monumental. To this day, he remains the yardstick of papal corruption. Every new pope elected is quietly judged against the Borgias. Well, at least he's not that guy, and maybe that's the most Borgia thing of all. He set the bar so low, the Vatican's still tripping over it. He didn't just rule the church, he rebranded it, with gold trim, silk sheets, and a suspiciously locked cellar.